Welcome to the Gene Loop continent, specifically the demonic sect of the Sacred Origin. And trust me, things are already unhinged from the jump. Our protagonist is tied to a bed, desperately begging the girls around him to let him go. But the woman just moves closer, completely unbothered, calling him her husband and telling him that's not happening. She reminds him with full seriousness that today is their wedding day. So how, she asks, could he possibly have the heart to leave his new bride alone in an empty room? Our guy's name is Xiao Mu, and yeah, as wild as it sounds, he's a transmigrator. And that woman fulfilling her twisted little fantasies by playing dress-up with different roles, yeah, she is absolutely not his wife. Hit subscribe to find out who she really is. It only gets crazier from here. 1 year ago, Xiao Mu transmigrated into this continent as a young noble. He even got engaged to a royal princess. Life was looking pretty good, not gonna lie. But just when things were about to peak, he got kidnapped by a group of demonic cultivators from the Sacred Origin sect, classic Isekai L. Back then, he had no idea that being taken prisoner was only the opening act. The real nightmare hadn't even started yet. Turns out his pure young body was the perfect resource for cultivating the mystical arts of the Nine Yin. Lucky him. And since nobody cares whether a servant disciple lives or dies, he became nothing more than a cultivation tool, a living battery for a group of beautiful and absolutely ruthless women. Subscribe now so you don't miss how he flips the script on these girls. He always had to work very hard. Even with his body packed full of pure yang qi, he was already teetering on the edge of having his vital energy completely drained dry. He tried to tell them he wasn't exactly thrilled about dying like this, but nobody was listening. One of the cultivators just kept doing what she was doing and told him with a straight face that he should feel honored to die by her hands. She held up a bottle and explained that inside was a yang solidification pill. With it, she could properly refine his potency and push his pure yang body to its limits. And hey, where I'm from, that pill is blue and it definitely solidifies things. She went on to explain that the Nine Yin mystical art she was cultivating was on the verge of a breakthrough, so he couldn't afford to be stingy with that body of his. No going soft now. She tossed several pills into his mouth and told him plainly if he helped her advance, at least he'd die with honor. Xiao Mu struggled against her, telling her to let him go. The girl pressed herself against him, urging him to push a little harder. And as his vision grew heavier and heavier, Xiao Mu's mind started drifting. He'd barely even gotten to know this world, and now he was really about to get drained to death by this filthy fox. A tremendous rage built up inside him. He clenched his fists so tightly his palms began to bleed. He refused to accept this. No matter what it took, he was going to find a way out of this nightmare. Backhand index pointing right, his comeback is insane. Subscribe and hit the bell so you're first to see more. Then suddenly, his consciousness was yanked somewhere else entirely. A system screen materialized in front of him, announcing that an extremely powerful will to survive had been detected. The return system had successfully awakened, and the host could now bind the system sphere. He stared at the message, stunned. A whole year had passed, but his chance to turn everything around had finally arrived, the moment he bound the sphere. The system's message shifted, declaring that it would ensure whoever gives shall also receive. Any act of donation by the host could trigger a return, with rewards of up to 10,000 times the value donated. Binding complete. The system also flagged a delay in the host receiving the system, and as compensation for all the time it had failed to appear, it announced that the first return would be guaranteed at 10,000 times. Welcome gift, apparently. He snapped back to consciousness, and the fox, still smirking, commented that his mouth kept saying no, but his body always told a very different story. Xiao Mu laughed, but it wasn't the warm kind. He thought about every humiliation, every degrading moment of the past year, living like a dog stripped of all dignity. His smile turned cold. He told her that this time he'd satisfy her properly. He pushed her back, which only made her happier. She teased him, wondering why he wouldn't just stop fighting it. The woman gave herself over to him completely, telling her husband not to hold back, to do whatever he wanted. Xiao Mu got to work, all while thinking that the heavens had handed him a second chance. And he was going to seize his own destiny with both hands and tear apart anyone foolish enough to stand in his way. The girl kept crying out that this night belonged only to the two of them. By the next morning, Xiao Mu was completely wrecked, and the fox was already up and standing. She noted almost casually that although he'd only contributed a tiny bit of pure yang power, his performance last night hadn't been bad. As she walked out, she added almost as an afterthought that it was a pity the yang solidification pills were still working through his system. But if he managed to survive, she'd come back for more fun. Xiao Mu just laid there, utterly spent, looking less like a person and more like a very stylish mummy. Then, out of nowhere, several system screens popped up, announcing that his pure yang power had been harvested by the 9-charm Heavenly Fox and would be returned to him 10,000 times over. With that, he obtained the Crimson Yang Sacred Body. The system began distributing the rewards and initiated the fusion. Dense, overwhelmingly powerful energy surged through every corner of his body. He began advancing rapidly, lasting straight through to the 10th layer of Qi refinement, great completion. Zhao Mu could feel his body practically boiling, Qi coursing through his veins like a current. Was this really the power of a sacred body? But he caught himself. Now was absolutely not the time to start drawing attention. In the demonic sect of the sacred origin, experts were as common as clouds. If anyone found out about the sacred body he'd just awakened, his fate would be far worse than serving as someone's cultivation vessel. The only path forward was simple: get stronger fast while nobody was watching. As he walked through the sect grounds, he thought it through. Spirit stones were the foundation of cultivation, and with his Crimson Yang sacred body, he could earn them by taking private jobs from local cultivators. That was one route, but now that he had the system, he needed to think on a completely different scale. Besides, most cultivators weren't exactly rolling in wealth. 3 or 4 spirit stones per visit was already considered a solid haul. There had to be a faster way. While he was still turning ideas over in his head, he heard a noise nearby. Wang Chan, an outer disciple of the Joyful Union sect, was deep in cultivation. Zhao Mu looked at him and felt something stir. When he'd first arrived, Wang Chan had taken good care of him. It was time to return that kindness. He figured if he donated the 200 spirit stones he'd scraped together over the past year, the system should kick back something decent. He tossed the bag of stones straight at Wang Chan's head. Wang Chan looked down at what had just hit him and broke into a massive grin, convinced that his relentless cultivation had moved some important figure in the sect who had clearly decided to bless him with spirit stones. Meanwhile, on the other side, the protagonist had activated a 500 times reward, which meant 100,000 spirit stones delivered directly to him. He couldn't believe how simple and fast making money could be, but greed is a powerful thing. He thought 100,000 is still pocket change. If he could trigger a 10,000 times return, that would be 2 million spirit stones. And in the future, he'd make everyone who ever humiliated him pay back 1,000,000 times more. Then a thought hit him: what if he just donated the system's spirit stones right back? Maybe he could chain trigger another return. He tossed a few stones to test it, catching Wang Chan completely off guard. Wang Chan looked around, wide-eyed, saying it was raining spirit stones again, and that he must have found himself a genuine guardian angel. Because of that, he swore to devote himself even harder to his cultivation. He couldn't let his benefactor down, but Zhao Mu, watching from the side, had his eyes locked on the system. Nothing, no reaction at all. Apparently you can't just loop the system like that. The exploit didn't work. Before he could think of another angle, a woman approached, asking with genuine surprise whether the protagonist had really not died. The moment he saw her, he did a double take. It was Luki. He greeted her respectfully. Luki was a cultivator he knew well. She was an outer sect disciple who cultivated the mystical art of the 9 yin. She'd looked after him when he first arrived, but after Chu Zhaoran had a word with her, she'd kept her distance ever since. Luki studied him carefully, noting that his cultivation had risen a lot in a short amount of time. From the looks of it, his pure yang body was even more powerful than she'd imagined. Zhao Mu thanked her for the praise and brushed it off as luck. She grabbed his hand and said this wasn't the time for small talk. Zhao Ran was going into seclusion for a breakthrough in the next few days, and while she was busy, the protagonist needed to help Luki cultivate. He drew her sword, telling him to get on. He climbed on, and the moment he did, he grabbed her waist and asked her to take it a little slower. Luki apologized and admitted that she hadn't seen him in months, and his cultivation, along with his entire aura, had changed completely. She asked if he'd gained something from that fox Zhao Ran. Zhao Mu took a deep breath and said that disgusting fox only knew how to take from him, so how could he have gained anything from her? Luki agreed, saying the demonic race was never generous, and if he stayed with that fox, sooner or later she'd drain every last drop of his pure yang and lead him straight to his death. But the moment she broke through to the core formation realm, she'd challenge Zhao Ran directly, and if she won, the protagonist would belong to her from that day forward. Zhao Mu lit up and hugged her even tighter, promising to do everything he could to help her reach that breakthrough. Luki went a little red, telling him he was too close, though in the back of his mind, he wasn't entirely thrilled with the phrase "belong to me." From where he was standing, they all just saw him as an object. Not long after, the two of them arrived at the inner area of the demonic sect of the sacred origin. They entered her house and she explained that she was on the verge of breaking through to the core formation realm. If the protagonist helped her get there, she'd reward him with an origin nourishment pill. She told him to stay put and wait. She was going to take a bath, but Zhao Mu only saw opportunity. Luki slipped off her clothes and slowly lowered herself into the bathtub. She murmured to herself that this time nothing would stop her. She was absolutely going to succeed. Zhao Mu stepped into the bathroom, smiling, and asked her, "Succeed at what exactly?" Luki flushed red and demanded to know why he'd suddenly walked in. Zhao Mu explained, completely straight-faced, that time was precious, and bathing together was simply more efficient. As they cultivated together, the protagonist couldn't help but compliment her. He told her the 9-yin mystical art she wielded was genuinely impressive. Luki, equally flustered, praised him back, saying his pure yang body was dominant and very large. Sometime later, the two of them were completely wiped out. Zhao Mu remarked that he never imagined someone who cultivated the 9-yin could be so, underneath it all, completely undone. Luki could barely breathe, wheezing that he'd worked far too hard during their cultivation session. With what little strength she had left, she told him it was enough for only him to know, and he didn't need to say it out loud. Zhao Mu just smiled and told her it was fine. Luki, a little flustered, brought up that she was getting married next month. His name was Long Tianqian. She told Zhao Mu he should know who that was, and the moment he heard that name, he went still. Long Tianqian had broken through to the nascent soul realm before the age of 30. A supreme genius, the kind that only appears once every 1,000 years in the demonic sect of the sacred origin. He'd even comprehended sword intent on his own, earning him a spot as a renowned expert on the Pride of Heaven list. Yeah, that kind of guy. Zhao Mu's face shifted. He pointed out very carefully that if someone of that caliber ever found out his wife had been sharing another man's sword, that would be a death sentence. Luki told him not to worry. Her fiancé, while training with an ancient sword manual, had damaged his own meridians, leaving his sword soft and completely non-functional. So as long as she didn't say a word, no one would ever find out. Besides, she added, if she didn't truly have feelings for the protagonist, she never would have given him her most precious thing, her backdoor. Zhao Mu was genuinely touched by that. He kissed her and told her that her breakthrough was close, so they needed to keep working hard. She laughed and told him he was absolutely tireless. The next morning, Zhao Mu got up. He pulled up the system, something was coming. Sure enough, the system flagged that his Crimson Yang power had been harvested, and the return was 800 times. His Crimson Yang sacred body surged in strength significantly. He had broken through to the Foundation establishment realm. He could barely believe it. In this short a time, he'd already crossed the threshold into Foundation establishment. At this pace, there'd be no reason to fear anyone, not Tianqiang, not the Long family, nobody. He glanced over at Luki and nudged her awake, asking where his reward was. Luki was still completely wrecked from cultivating all night. She handed him the pill with a trembling hand, saying he was unbelievable. She genuinely couldn't take any more and was begging him to let her sleep just a little longer. He looked down and saw that he'd received 10 origin nourishment pills. Luki was being seriously generous. He'd need to donate some pills anyway, so why not push it a little further? He slipped one pill to Luki. The system immediately flagged it, 1 grade 2 origin nourishment pill donated. Return 30 times, he obtained a grade 3 origin nourishment pill. Zhao Mu was not impressed. 30 times felt like an insult. But he still had 9 attempts left. He didn't need 10,000 times. 1,000 times return was absolutely within reach. He handed her another pill, and this time, the return activated at 3,000 times. Now that was what he was talking about. He obtained a grade 7 marrow cleansing pill. He examined it carefully. A real marrow cleansing pill, no question about it. This was an actual treasure. Like the origin nourishment pill, the marrow cleansing pill strengthened the foundation, but that was just its secondary effect. Its true value was its ability to improve a cultivator's bone root aptitude. With his innate pure yang body, Zhao Mu's aptitude was already excellent by mortal standards, but compared to the sect's true prodigies, he barely even registered. If he wanted to push past his limits and reach a new level entirely, he needed to raise the ceiling on his potential. The moment he swallowed the pill, an absurd wave of energy flooded through his entire body. He dropped to the floor and told himself to refine it immediately. Not long after, Zhao Mu stood back up and Luki immediately wrinkled her nose, demanding to know why he smelled so terrible and telling him to go take a bath. He said he'd go right away. He headed to the bathroom and started washing himself down. But Luki followed him in, and the moment she saw him, her eyes went wide. She asked if he'd actually broken through to Foundation establishment, questioning whether the origin nourishment pills were really that effective. Still stunned, she ran her hand across his body and pushed further. Even reaching Foundation establishment shouldn't have purified his body this thoroughly. She asked point-blank if he'd taken some other pill. Zhao Mu weighed his options. Explaining everything would be complicated. And if she found out he'd gotten his hands on a marrow cleansing pill, that would be very bad. So instead, he pressed her gently against the wall and said it was all thanks to the dual cultivation they'd done together, though it seemed like she still hadn't fully formed her core yet. He leaned in and told her it must have been because he hadn't worked hard enough, so he'd help her one more time, and this time it was on him, free of charge. Luki, already running on fumes, called him a complete maniac, asking if he was trying to kill them both from exhaustion. He insisted he was only trying to help her advance faster. A few hours later, Luki could barely breathe. Zhao Mu said his goodbyes, telling her to take all the time she needed to advance, but he had to go. The system chimed in again. His pure yang power had been harvested by Luki and returned 10 times stronger, producing a modest increase in his crimson yang power. Zhao Mu moved through the sect with startling ease, genuinely impressed by the difference Foundation establishment made. His entire body felt like it was floating. Once he had a flying sword, he could cut across the sky and travel wherever he pleased. That night, at the Outer Sect Market, Zhao Mu came looking for something specific, a flying sword called the Star Slayer. Forged from meteoric iron that fell from outer space and engraved with the star voice formation, it absorbed the power of the stars themselves to amplify its lethality. The sword alone ran 30,000 spirit stones. He paid it without much hesitation and immediately started wondering what kind of multiplier he'd get once he donated it. Then, out of nowhere, someone called out, stopping him dead in his tracks and saying they'd finally found him. A giant of a man stood in front of him and he did not look happy. Zhao Mu recognized him immediately. Nudi, an outer sect disciple and one of Zhao Ran's most devoted and insufferable suitors. He'd already tried to cause trouble for the protagonist several times before, but Zhao Ran had always stepped in and shut it down. Currently, Nudi sat in the Foundation establishment realm, and on top of that he'd inherited the blood of a bull demon, making his raw strength far beyond any normal cultivator at the same level. Zhao Mu sized him up immediately, perfect for a test run. Nudi grabbed the protagonist by the shirt, completely furious, demanding to know if it was true that he'd met with Zhao Ran again. Zhao Mu calmly grabbed his hand back and asked what business it was of his whether the two of them met. Nudi's blood was boiling. He pulled back to attack, shouting that Zhao Mu would die right here, right now, but the protagonist stopped the attack cold with one hand. He even had the nerve to apologize, explaining that he intended to keep that life of his so he could keep having fun with Zhao Ran. The horned bull finally registered it. The protagonist had also broken through to Foundation establishment. Nudi dug in deeper, unleashing even more of his strength, snarling that just because they were in the same realm didn't mean they were on the same level. He told Zhao Mu to brace himself because now he'd see the true power of Lord Nudi. Zhao Mu just weaved through every attack with a relaxed smile, noting that his opponent was certainly strong, but his speed left a lot to be desired. Nudi roared at him to shut up and kept swinging, insisting he'd never beat him. Zhao Mu watched him throw punch after punch and thought the Crimson Yang's sacred body was genuinely something else. He'd only just advanced, and he was already handling Nudi with ease, a guy who sat comfortably in the outer sect's top 100. Then, in one clean motion, Zhao Mu broke his opponent's stance completely. He said flatly that it was time to end this. He drove his fist straight into Nudi's face. And that was all it took. Nudi's followers rushed over, shocked, asking how that kid had suddenly gotten this strong. They pointed at Zhao Mu and called him a little punk, demanding to know how he dared injure their boss. Did he forget who the Nudi family was within this sect? Zhao Mu smiled and said he was actually glad they'd brought that up. He drew his flying sword and sent it forward. It stopped dead next to one of Nudi's followers' head, lodged in the wood right beside his ear. The man went pale. Zhao Mu explained calmly that the flying sword was worth 30,000 spirit stones, more than enough to cover that idiot's medical bills. The system registered it instantly. A grade 2 flying sword had been donated. Return 1,000 times. He obtained a grade 5 flying sword, the Heavenly Star Talisman. He looked it over. Grade 5 wasn't exactly elite, but it'd do the job. Nudi's two subordinates clocked that the protagonist had his back turned and decided that was their window. Zhao Mu spun around before they could even close the distance, calling them reckless fools and making it clear that whatever came next was entirely self-defense. But before they could take another step, someone struck both of them from behind. They spun around, demanding to know who hit them. A woman looked at them with barely concealed irritation, saying that from where she was standing, a pair of shameless thugs was trying to play victim. She made it very clear she'd watched them attack first. Her name was Mu Juling. She walked straight over to the protagonist and immediately started scolding him, asking if he had any idea how reckless he was being. She reminded him she'd already told him, when dealing with enemies, you pull the problem out by the roots. The two beaten men looked her up and down and demanded to know who she thought she was, and whether she had any idea who their boss was. Juling looked at them and said her name clearly, Mu Juling. The moment the name landed, both men turned and bolted, screaming that she was the senior sister of the sect. They couldn't let her record their faces. One of them shouted that it was all Boss Nudi's fault and that none of this had anything to do with them. Juling watched them disappear and shook her head, nothing but cowards. She turned her scolding straight back to the protagonist, and he stood there genuinely confused, asking what exactly he'd done wrong. Juling stepped closer and reminded him, had he already forgot, she'd told him that if anything went wrong, all he had to do was say her name. She let out a small sigh of relief, saying that luckily she'd been nearby, because if he died, who on earth was she supposed to marry? Zhao Mu thought about it. This girl had had her eye on him since the day he stepped foot in the sect. And not because of his pure yang power, but because of his face. Genuinely refreshing, honestly. The demonic sect of the sacred origin had a reputation for producing terrifying, ruthless women, and Mu Juling was no exception. But none of those people who feared her probably had any idea she had this kind of soft, flustered side hidden underneath. Zhao Mu told her to calm down. He wasn't as easy to kill as she seemed to think. Juling insisted that her future husband couldn't afford to take even the smallest risk, so he was coming with her. The two of them took to the sky together, and Zhao Mu noticed immediately flying at that altitude without a sword beneath her feet was a technique only core formation cultivators could pull off. So just what level had this girl actually reached? Not long after, they touched down somewhere else entirely. She brought them both to the ground. The moment Zhao Mu landed, he felt it. The spiritual energy here was dense, almost overwhelming. This had to be the central sanctuary of the demonic sect of the sacred origin. Juling told him to come inside. This was her home. Zhao Mu stared at the place and quietly revised his theory. She might be a personal disciple. He stepped through the door, looked around, and asked if she really lived here. Juling explained that when she truly wanted to rest, this was the place she came to read and sleep in peace, so she wasn't here very often. She threw herself onto the bed and looked at him, asking why he was still standing there. Get over here. Zhao Mu told her not to pull any tricks. His self-control had real limits. She went red in the face, calling him a shameless womanizer and demanding to know what exactly he thought she was doing. She grabbed some books and tossed them in his direction. He looked at the titles and his eyes went wide. One was the true chapter of sword control. The other was the One Kai Mystic Heart sword art. He asked how she'd known he wanted to learn sword control. Juling gave him a look. He'd just broken through to Foundation establishment and immediately ran to the market to buy a flying sword. It wasn't exactly subtle. She also threw him a sword, a gift, grade 4 flying sword, ice attribute, the Frostblade. Juling took a quiet breath and told him she could feel that his inner pure yang had been running quite restless lately. The Frostblade was perfect for suppressing that blazing inner fire of his, so maybe he'd stop thinking about certain things every minute of the day. Zhao Mu thanked her sincerely. She really had thought of everything. Juling told him to stay here over the next few days and focus on sword control. She'd handle everything else. Now that he'd reached Foundation establishment, he no longer needed to remain a servant disciple. She'd have someone update his jade tablet to the outer sect ranking. Zhao Mu stared at her. The things she could casually arrange, he had to ask who exactly she was. Juling just smiled and said simply, the person he was going to end up marrying, as soon as the door closed behind her. He smiled to himself and thought, this girl really knew how to get under a man's skin. But enough of that. Right now, the most important thing was mastering sword control. He settled in and began to cultivate. But he hit a wall almost immediately and couldn't help asking himself why. He'd taken the marrow cleansing pill to boost his aptitude, so why was sword control still this brutally difficult? A new thought crept in. Was it possible the marrow cleansing pill had only improved his body, without doing anything for his comprehension? He sat there genuinely stumped. He had the system, sure, but if comprehension was the wall blocking him, all the spirit stones in the world wouldn't help. He'd be crying himself to death with nothing to show for it. Then he noticed a small animal sitting right beside him, and something clicked. If donating primordial yang could trigger a return, then sharing knowledge, transmitting comprehension should also count as a donation. A slow grin spread across his face. He looked at the little creature and told it that it looked bored. Though maybe he could teach it a bit of multiplication. After running through a short lesson with the beast, the system activated. The host had enlightened a demonic beast and transmitted knowledge. Return 100 times. Host's comprehension increased significantly. Zhao Mu pumped his fist. The idea had actually worked. With his comprehension sharpened, he went back to cultivating, and this time he felt real progress. He guided his sword through the air, grinning. Not bad at all. Techniques that had seemed completely out of reach before suddenly clicked into place effortlessly. Even so, he knew a small jump in comprehension wasn't going to cut it in a world like this. Thinking it through clearly, for a transmigrator, this level was still nowhere near enough. He looked back at the animal, picked it up, and told it very seriously that it clearly had a thirst for knowledge, so today, the teacher would be covering geometry. He kept going and the system tallied the results. The host had taught calculus to a demonic beast. Return 100 times, comprehension increased drastically. Then a new message appeared. The host's comprehension had reached the maximum limit for the current cultivation stage and could not be increased further. Zhao Mu blinked. There really was a ceiling, but at this level, understanding techniques shouldn't be a problem anymore. He got moving immediately, working through the Vajra fist. Then the Crimson Thunder art of the Soon Wind, and even the divination of the 3 talents and 6 destinies. He deflated a little though. They were all unranked yellow-grade techniques, way too basic for where he was now. Still, he memorized every single one. If he copied them out and distributed them later, he could chain a solid batch of returns from the system. The little animal padded over and dropped a bone at his feet. He looked down at it curiously, then started petting the beast, asking if it really wanted to give him that bone. He picked it up and thanked the creature, telling it he'd make some soup out of it later. But the moment he held it, he felt a lingering energy embedded in the bone. He looked more closely at what was written on it, the chaotic dark mystic art. He sat down hard on the floor. He genuinely hadn't expected this little guy to just hand him a technique out of nowhere. The system flagged it immediately. Chaotic dark mystic art detected. Auto-learning initiated. A brutal headache tore through his skull. He coughed up blood. He forced himself to think through it. His comprehension had already hit the ceiling for foundation establishment, and even so, he still couldn't make sense of this technique. That meant one thing: it was likely an Earth-grade technique, maybe even heavenly grade. Juling came back, and the moment she stepped in, she took one look at him and asked what had happened. She rushed over, saw that he was clearly unwell, and immediately blamed herself, saying she should never have handed him a technique that difficult right from the start. Zhao Mu tried to explain that wasn't quite what happened, but she cut him off and told him cultivation couldn't be rushed. She prepared some food. They were going to sit down, eat, and rest. And to make sure he actually recovered properly, she told him to open his mouth. She'd feed him herself. He accepted the food, and as he chewed, his mind was already running calculations. She was right here. That meant he could try to make some real progress. He picked up the bone and held it out to her, telling her he wanted to pass that technique along to her and asking if it was worth anything. Juling went still. She asked him where he had gotten that. Zhao Mu explained that one of the demonic beasts had given it to him, but the content was far too advanced for him to cultivate, so he thought it made more sense to pass it to her. The system locked in immediately. An Earth-grade technique, the chaotic dark mystic art, had been gifted. Return 60 times. He obtained an upper-level Earth-grade technique, the Pure Yang Dark Mystic Art. On top of that, the system detected compatibility between the Pure Yang Dark Mystic Art and the host's Crimson Yang Sacred Body and offered to begin the fusion immediately. But Zhao Mu held off. With Juling sitting right there, now wasn't the right time. He had no idea how long the fusion would take, and the last thing he needed was to raise suspicion with her watching. But before he could think further, Juling shot to her feet furious, spitting that idiotic dog had stolen her technique again and nearly destroyed her husband's future in the process. Zhao Mu asked what she meant by destroying his future. Juling explained luckily he hadn't forced himself to push through it. His constitution was pure yang and that dark mystic art carried chaos attributes. Those two things directly conflicted. If he'd insisted on forcing the cultivation, his meridians could have ruptured and he'd have died on the spot. Zhao Mu finally understood. It wasn't a comprehension problem at all. It was a fundamental incompatibility between the technique and his own constitution. Juling stressed that his constitution was rare, and because of that, very few techniques were actually compatible with him. She needed time to gather suitable ones. Until then, he should stick to basic introductory techniques and build up his foundation properly. That was the right way forward. Zhao Mu raised an eyebrow and told her she was being far too good to him and asked what she was really after. Juling tilted her head and asked if her intentions still weren't obvious enough. She told him simply all he had to do was submit to her. If he became her Tao companion, she'd guarantee him a life of luxury in the demonic sect of the sacred origin. Not a single person would dare lay a finger on him. She settled onto his lap, but before either of them could say another word, a voice cut through the air and the sheer pressure behind it instantly shattered the house around them. An overwhelming force struck from above, demolishing the structure entirely. Both of them tensed up immediately. Zhao Mu looked up at the woman hovering in the air above them. That oppressive aura was suffocating. Who on earth was she? Juling immediately called out to her master and asked why she was there. Zhao Mu felt a cold chill run down his spine. The master looked down at the two of them and asked almost casually if she was interrupting something. Juling bowed her head and apologized, saying she would never dare. Her master descended slowly, telling her that she was the disciple she valued most above all others, that she had always intended for her to inherit her position as the sex saintess. But just look at what she was doing with that. Neglecting her own cultivation wasn't enough, she was hiding a servant disciple in her quarters, flirting around as if she had no responsibilities at all. Zhao Mu quietly processed the information. The sex saintess was Juling's master. That explained a lot, including why Juling had always moved through the world with that particular brand of untouchable confidence. Juling dropped to her knees before her master, bowing her head and admitting she had been wrong. The saintess picked up a sword and with an almost gentle tone said that since her disciple had acknowledged her mistake, she truly deserved a second chance. She drove the sword into the ground in front of Juling and gave her order, eliminate the servant disciple with her own hands, sever this emotional attachment completely, and then return to Purple Cloud Peak for 30 years of secluded cultivation. Juling refused. She tried to explain to her master that the protagonist had nothing to do with any of this, and that if her master forced her hand, it would damage her Tao heart, and her cultivation would never progress again. The saintess narrowed her eyes and asked if that was supposed to be a threat. The pressure she radiated intensified, crushing down on both of them. Zhao Mu realized with cold clarity that this woman was genuinely considering killing her own disciple. Without hesitating, he moved to shield Juling. The moment he touched her, Juling turned to him and asked what he was doing. He told her to absorb the spiritual power from his body. The saintess studied him with a flicker of surprise. She'd initially assumed he was a pure yang body. But looking more carefully, she corrected herself. He had awakened the crimson yang sacred body. Zhao Mu helped Juling stabilize and remarked that the saintess's eyes were as sharp as her reputation suggested. The saintess acknowledged it. The crimson yang sacred body was extraordinarily rare, which meant the man her disciple had chosen carried enormous potential. Juling practically vibrated with excitement the moment she heard it confirmed. She blurted out that if she'd known sooner, she would have tied him up and turned him into a stepping stone a long time ago. The saintess called both of them to order. Juling caught herself and apologized, saying she'd spoken without thinking. Zhao Mu stepped in quickly and said Juling was clearly just joking. The saintess let out a slow breath and said fine. For her disciple's sake, she'd allow the protagonist to keep his life. But he needed to return to the outer sect and focus entirely on his cultivation and not stop until he reached the nascent soul realm. Before that threshold, he had no business coming to find Juling again. As soon as they left, Zhao Mu exhaled and let himself process what had just happened. That power was on another level entirely. If the saintess had genuinely decided to kill him, it would have taken nothing more than a single thought. He understood it clearly now. He needed to get far, far stronger than he currently was, and fast. Not long after, back in the servants' courtyard, Zhao Mu pushed open the door to his room and muttered that the trip had been risky, but at minimum he'd walked away with an upper-level Earth-grade technique and a grade 4 flying sword. Not a bad haul. He told the system to start the fusion, and he sat down to concentrate. Energy began moving through his meridians, dense and rapid. He thought the cultivation speed was absurd. The combined effect of the pure yang dark mystic art fusing with the crimson yang sacred body had to be the reason. Then the system flagged an error, insufficient spiritual energy detected in the surrounding environment. It asked if he wanted to automatically absorb spirit stones for cultivation. He had no other option. He said yes. He had earned all those spirit stones without lifting a finger anyway. The system restarted cultivation. Spiritual energy flooded his body, dense and overwhelming. He let himself sink into it. Sometime later, he glanced to the side and realized he'd burned through 70,000 spirit stones in a single night. But in that same night, he'd pushed through to the third stage of foundation establishment. All things considered, that wasn't bad at all. The next problem was already clear. He needed to figure out how to make money again. Before he could even form a plan, 3 people appeared at his door. The one leading them was Hu Qiang, a servant disciple at the 8th stage of Qi refinement. He swaggered in with a smirk, saying he'd heard Zhao Ran had been showing the protagonist a lot of benefits lately. He cracked his knuckles and asked if Zhao Mu wasn't going to show them a little consideration. Zhao Mu remembered exactly who this was. Qiang was the kind of guy who used his above-average cultivation to bully and extort everyone weaker than him in the servants' courtyard, a classic small-time tyrant. Once, a newly arrived servant disciple had dared to talk back to him and was beaten to death that very same night. Zhao Mu looked straight at him and said flatly that a man who lives by robbing others must have stacked up quite a collection of spirit stones by now. Qiang's face darkened. He demanded to know what business that was of his. and cocked back to attack, shouting that the protagonist was asking for a beating. Zhao Mu sidestepped it without even trying and asked if he really thought that pathetic speed was going to land a hit. He told Chiang he needed to learn how to actually strike a person. Then Zhao Mu threw his own punch, telling him to watch carefully and take notes. One hit and Chiang nearly folded. His followers scrambled over, asking if he was all right. Chiang looked up in disbelief and asked if the protagonist had actually broken through to Foundation establishment. Zhao Mu laughed and asked if that wasn't already pretty obvious. Chiang quickly realized he had no shot alone. He barked at his two companions to stop standing around and attack together. Both of them rushed in and Zhao Mu dodged them both without breaking a sweat. The bystanders watching were surprised. None of them had expected Zhao Mu to advance this fast. One girl pointed out that even so, he'd only just broken through, so holding off multiple Qi realm cultivators at once was still no simple thing. Wang Chan, watching with visible concern, shouted at the protagonist to be careful. But with one move, Zhao Mu sent both opponents flying and told them to get out of his sight. Jiang, who had transformed, tried to launch a sneak attack from behind. But Zhao Mu was already turning around, a grin on his face. He sent Chiang airborne with a single punch. Chiang hit the ground and still tried to open his mouth. Zhao Mu walked over calmly and told him to shut it. He pressed him into the ground and kept him there. With that, the servants' courtyard had its tyrant dethroned and everyone watching knew it. Zhao Mu dug through Chiang's belongings and took the spirit stones. Then he called everyone over and told them plainly, every spirit stone that trash had stolen from people was going back to its rightful owner today. He threw the spirit stones out into the crowd, and people dove for them, laughing and cheering, wishing the protagonist a long and prosperous life. The system tallied it up: 9,000 spirit stones donated. Return 1,000 times. He obtained 9 million spirit stones. Zhao Mu laughed to himself. Spirit stones were not going to be a problem for a while. He walked over to Wang Chan and told him that since he'd always looked after the protagonist from the very beginning, he wanted to give him something. Wang Chan's eyes went wide, asking if that was a Kai refinement pill. He shook his head and tried to push it back, saying something that valuable couldn't just be handed out as a gift. Zhao Mu told him to knock it off and threw the pill straight into his friend's mouth before he could argue any further. The system flagged it: 1 grade 1 Kai refinement pill donated. Return 100 times. He obtained a grade 2 Foundation establishment pill. Wang Chan shook his head slowly, telling Zhao Mu he was genuinely stunned by how far he'd come. But he needed to hear something important. The people behind Chiang and Nudie weren't small players. The sooner he got into the outer sect and found a master, the better. Zhao Mu nodded. That was exactly the plan. Not long after, inside the outer sect management hall, the outer sect manager Zhang Dingkun was hunched over a massive cauldron, deep in whatever he was doing. Zhao Mu stepped into the hall and greeted him. Dingkun looked up, startled by the sudden presence, and misjudged the fire level completely. The cauldron exploded. Dingkun turned on the protagonist immediately, snapping that it was his fault for breaking his spiritual focus. He declared that an entire furnace of violet cheap pills had been wasted and ordered Zhao Mu to leave at once. Zhao Mu took one look at the situation and thought it through. The manager had clearly blown up those pills on purpose, and based on the heat signature, he wasn't even refining anything as valuable as violet cheap pills. So why was he making things difficult out of nowhere? Someone was pulling strings behind all of this. Dingkun kept up the performance, asking why he was still standing there. Zhao Mu told him not to be so hasty and set 50,000 spirit stones on the counter as compensation for the trouble. The manager's entire attitude flipped in an instant. He called the protagonist's little brother with a warm smile, asked if he was there to pick up his outer sect jade tablet, and said he'd handle it right away. Zhao Mu thanked him for the swift service, but said he had one more question. Who exactly was trying to block him from becoming an outer sect disciple? Dingkun shook his head and said he only accepted money to solve problems. He wouldn't dare betray anyone. Zhao Mu said he understood completely, and asked, hypothetically speaking, what might happen if he added just a little more to that pile. Dingkun gestured for him to come closer. He drew a fox on the ground. Zhao Mu's expression darkened. That insufferable Chu Zhao ran. Of course it was her blocking his path. She held significant status within the outer sect, and her network of spies and informants stretched everywhere. If he kept wandering around carelessly, it was only a matter of time before he ended up back in her hands. Zhao Mu thanked the manager for the warning. Dingkun said he hadn't said a word. With everything handled, Zhao Mu picked up his sword and headed out, already thinking that he needed to find Luki. Maybe he could lay low at her place for a while. But as he got close to her house, he noticed two men walking out. Tian Shang, 5th on the Pride of Heaven list within the demonic sect of the Sacred Origin, and beside him the 12th elder Lu Heikong. The elder chuckled and said that now that Luki had finally broken through to the golden core stage, perhaps it was time they started seriously discussing the wedding arrangements between the two. Tian Qiang said with measured confidence that once he took first place in this year's great hunting competition, he would come for her hand. He said he was looking forward to the great day. Zhao Mu watched from the shadows, deeply unimpressed. Just that, cuckolded Tian Qiang. The moment they were gone, he walked to her door and called out to ask if she was there. Luki opened the door, face lighting up the moment she saw him. He stepped inside and asked if Tian Qiang had come around again to push the marriage talk. She went stiff and told him bluntly not to say that guy's name in front of her. She didn't want to hear it. She pulled him into a hug and changed the subject entirely, asking what he was doing here on his own. Zhao Mu explained that it was all that disgusting fox's doing. Zhao Ran was making life difficult for him in the outer sect. Luki told him she'd finally broken through to the core formation stage, and once her cultivation stabilized over the next few days, she planned to challenge Zhao Ran directly. But she also wanted to say something else. She thanked him. Without his help reaching core formation, this quickly would never have been possible. She climbed on top of him and he told her that if she kept this up, he wasn't going to be able to hold back his blazing yang energy. Luki asked whoever told him he had to hold anything back. She tore her own clothes open and told him to help her cultivate right now, and so the two of them began. And the next day, Luki was completely wrecked. Again, the system flagged it. His blazing yang energy had been plundered and the return activated at 50 times. His blazing yang energy increased slightly. He stared at that number and immediately asked why it was so low. The system explained it plainly. Luki had plundered him multiple times already, so the return rewards were gradually decreasing with each session. He processed that. The more he invested in a single person, the lower that multiplier was going to drop. Which meant the solution was obvious. If he cultivated with more partners, he could keep the system's reward rate healthy across the board. Yep, he was definitely on the right path. But that was a problem for later. Right now, getting stronger was the only thing that mattered and he needed to move fast. He sat down and began cultivating and pushed through to the 4th stage of foundation establishment. But his spirit stones were burning through faster than he expected, and he could barely scrape his way to the 5th stage before they ran dry. The Crimson Yang sacred body was an absolute monster to maintain. It devoured resources like nothing else. Which meant it was time to go earn some more. Then he caught movement outside, a shadow passing by. He pulled the window open and asked what was going on, and came face to face with the Saintess. His entire body went cold. The Saintess introduced herself calmly, saying her name was An Zixuan and told him to call her that from now on. Zhao Mu steadied himself and asked what had brought such an esteemed young lady all the way out here just to see him. Zixuan kept her eyes fixed on him, then reached out and pressed her hand against his abdomen, saying she wanted his pure yang energy to assist her cultivation. Zhao Mu carefully pushed her hand back, and with all due respect told her that she couldn't afford to play around with these things. Techniques at her level took enormous time to develop in the later stages. She certainly didn't need his help for that. Zixuan's expression darkened. She told him he was being insolent, and used her power to press him flat onto the bed. The spiritual pressure bearing down on him was suffocating. He couldn't move an inch. The Saintess told him plainly that now was not the time for useless back and forth. He only needed to answer yes or no. The protagonist took one look at the situation and said if she was asking with such warmth and politeness, then he was willing to do absolutely anything. Internally, he told himself to survive this moment, because one day this woman would be right where he wanted her. He looked up at her and said he just needed to know which position she preferred, so they could cultivate in the most effective way possible. Zixuan blinked. A faint flush crossed her face. She told him not to ask things he had no business asking. Then she opened a portal and pulled the two of them through it. Into the Purple Heaven Grotto, she told him to follow her because this was the Purple Heaven Grotto, her personal seclusion space. No one would disturb them here. Zhao Mu immediately started unbuttoning his pants and Zixuan went red, demanding to know what he was doing. He told her he was simply cooperating with her harvest for cultivation. Zixuan, let's call her Zixuan, told him he didn't need to remove his clothes. She had her own methods for handling that. The protagonist laughed and said he understood completely. From the looks of it, the young lady preferred to take the initiative herself. He'd known a few women like that. But based on his experience, the effects only reached their full potential when both sides were actively cooperating. Zixuan silenced him on the spot, then bound him to a post and told him to close his eyes and stay quiet. That was how he could best assist her in cultivation. She began slowly removing her clothes, adding that if he chose not to cooperate, he could simply die instead. Zhao Mu agreed immediately. Then she threw him into the water, telling him to wash himself properly first. The protagonist said he would do exactly as the Saintess wished. When he finished bathing and started drying off, he muttered to himself, was he dreaming? The saintess cut him off and told him to shut up. She threw him onto the bed. Zhao Mu lay there genuinely stunned, thinking he had never imagined the saintess would be this dominant. And honestly, there was no resisting this kind of charm, but suddenly he felt something licking his face. He opened his eyes and found two girls staring back at him. One in white and pink Lele, the other in white and blue Yuan Yuan. The two of them looked at him and asked what his problem was. Were they not beautiful enough for him? Yuan Yuan explained that they were puppets created by their master, assigned specifically to absorb the protagonist's crimson yang power. Lele warned him to cooperate perfectly. The two of them would be done in an hour at most. The protagonist felt genuinely offended. Human tools absorbing his crimson yang power, and they thought 1 hour was enough. He asked, did they have any idea who they were dealing with? Zhao Mu grabbed Yuan Yuan and flipped her onto the bed, announcing he was about to show them exactly what he was made of. Lele grabbed his arm and told him to be a little gentler with her sister. He looked at her, she let go of his arm. After that, only screaming could be heard. A few hours later, the saintess was watching from outside and quietly wondering how much longer that beast was going to keep going. They finally finished. The two were completely spent, neither of them could move. The protagonist slipped into the hot spring and thought to himself that this thermal water genuinely replenished his crimson yang power. They'd been at it for a good while and somehow he was still full of energy. The two girls wincing with every step. Certain parts of their bodies significantly sore made their way to the saintess and knelt before her, offering the harvested power and declaring they deserved death for failing. The protagonist's constitution was simply too dominant, and that was why it had taken so long. Zixuan looked a little flustered and told them she'd watched everything. It wasn't their fault at all. She told the two to leave the crimson yang fluid behind and go treat their injuries. They bowed deeply and thanked her for her understanding. While the protagonist was getting dressed, the saintess approached. He asked how he'd done. She said it was more or less acceptable. Zixuan handed him his rewards, and he nearly dropped them. 10 million spirit stones, and 4 bottles of supreme-grade foundation establishment pills, just like that. He thanked her profusely, saying this was exactly what you'd expect from the saintess, truly the most generous person he had ever met. Zixuan looked at him and told him he could leave now. Why was he still standing there? The protagonist paused and mentioned if she truly wanted to absorb his crimson yang power, direct dual cultivation would yield far better results. Something worth considering. Zixuan's expression shifted ever so slightly. But embarrassment won out. She opened the gate and told him to get out. She didn't want to look at him right now. And just like that, he was sent straight back to Luki's house. He looked around, blinked, and realized he'd been deposited in the exact same spot. The saintess's methods really were on another level entirely. The system chimed in. A massive amount of crimson yang power had been contributed to Zixuan, and as a result, the crimson yang sacred body had been significantly enhanced. He immediately got to work refining all the energy he'd just gained, and couldn't help but smile. It was exactly as he'd suspected. Switching partners really did produce better rewards. The math was working out beautifully. Besides, as long as the great saintess needed his crimson yang power, he had a guaranteed foothold within the sect. Nobody was going to touch him. Meanwhile, back in Purple Heaven, the saintess had placed the protagonist's crimson yang fluid on a plate and was staring at it, quietly hoping that boy's fluid wouldn't disappoint her. Then her mind drifted back to everything she had witnessed. She caught herself and tried to push the thoughts away. She reminded herself he was nothing more than a cultivation vessel. She could not allow him to distract her from her path. Yuan Yuan and Lele, watching their master from nearby, exchanged a glance. The saintess had definitely gotten distracted during cultivation. Lele whispered to her sister, was it possible that the boy's crimson yang fluid had some kind of side effect? The next morning, Luki woke up and found the protagonist already deep in cultivation. She walked over and told him he was up early. He was becoming more and more dedicated. Zhao Mu said that by chance he'd felt a slight pull of inspiration to advance. She threw herself on top of him anyway, saying that now that his realm had increased, he could join her in challenging the path to heaven. The path to heaven, an ancient secret realm belonging to the demonic sect of the sacred origin. 12 levels in total. Just reaching the 3rd level was enough to qualify for the outer sect's top 100 on the Pride of Heaven list. Because starting from the 3rd level, great demons of the Golden Core realm began to appear. Luki mentioned that Zhao Ran held 9th place on the outer sect's Pride of Heaven list, and she could hold her own on the 4th level for the duration of a burning incense stick. The protagonist told her she didn't need to do all of this for him. Luki clarified that honestly she wasn't doing it just for him, she was doing it for herself too. Everyone kept saying that Disgusting Fox was the cultivator with the greatest potential in the outer sect, but Luki disagreed. She genuinely wanted to see, in the end, whether humans or demons would prevail. Zhao Mu thought about it. The demonic sect of the sacred origin preached equal treatment of humans and demons, but the reality was messier than that. Conflicts and friction never truly stopped. He eventually agreed, telling her that now that he was an outer sect disciple too, they could go together. She smiled and said, "Perfect." But before they could even get inside, people were already coming out. One guy groaned that he'd failed again. The monsters on the 3rd level were absolutely brutal. Others around him wondered how the prodigies ever managed to push through, while the chubbier one shrugged and said that was exactly why they were called the Pride of Heaven. They turned and bowed to Nudie, saying he was incredible. His ranking had jumped to 47th after this run, and at this pace, he'd definitely break into the top 10. Nudie laughed and said, obviously, talent and effort. He was currently ranked 79th on the Pride of Heaven list. But the moment he looked to the side, he saw Zhao Ran, and she did not look calm. She snapped at him, reminding him she was the one who helped him advance his cultivation, so he needed to finish the task she'd given him. Now, Nudie said he'd get it done immediately. He walked straight toward Luki, asking if she was really about to challenge the path to heaven alongside some pretty boy who lived off other people's generosity. Luki fired right back, asking if the protagonist was really just a pretty little boy, because last she heard that pretty boy had already put Nudie flat on his back. Nudie snarled that the protagonist had caught him completely off guard in the middle of the chaos. The protagonist didn't even look at him, just told him that a loser shouldn't be making a scene. They had a path to heaven to challenge. Nudie's temper snapped. He swung at the protagonist, but the protagonist dodged instantly, pulling Luki out of the way in the same motion. Nudie slammed a token onto the ground. A circle of light spread outward as the system announced outer sect disciple Nudie had issued a formal duel challenge. The protagonist must choose to accept or refuse. The barrier locked in and no one else could cross it. Luki grabbed the protagonist's arm and told him not to accept. Nudie's cultivation had gone up a lot, and he couldn't afford to let himself get baited into a fight with his head hot. Zhao Mu told her to relax. He knew exactly what he was doing. The protagonist walked toward his opponent and said he'd like to make things a little more interesting. Nudie grinned and said that if he somehow lost, he'd return the grade 2 flying sword he'd taken from the protagonist. Zhao Mu said that was fine, and in that case he'd put the storage ring on his finger on the line. The challenge was confirmed. Word spread instantly and a crowd gathered. People said Nudie was going up against that pretty boy from the servants' courtyard. On top of that, the protagonist had just been promoted to outer sect disciple, and rumors were already flying, something about a pure yang body and every 9 yin cultivator in the outer sect apparently having already had their way with him. Some guys in the crowd were visibly jealous. Luki heard every word and looked like she was about to start a separate fight entirely. Zhao Ran saw her opening and twisted the knife, saying she'd always wondered why the protagonist seemed so distracted whenever she was harvesting his essence. So it was because he had a lover like Luki on the side, but she supposed that was actually convenient. The best fate for a bird that kept trying to fly away was to be strangled with her own hands. She told Nudie to use everything he had, not to worry about life or death. He couldn't afford to waste the opportunity she'd given him. Nudie told her not to worry, he would never disappoint her. He unleashed his strength and charged straight at the protagonist. Luki tensed up and called out for him to be careful, but Nudie came in with everything. The resulting impact sent shockwaves through the air. People in the crowd identified it immediately: shadow steps. Nudie was already feared for his raw strength, and now that he'd mastered shadow steps on top of that, his power had jumped to a completely different level. Someone muttered that the protagonist was done. This might genuinely be the shortest duel in the history of the demonic sect of the sacred origin. Zhao Ran just laughed, saying it was a pity. If the protagonist had just been a good obedient little dog for her, maybe he would have lived a bit longer. But before she could turn to leave, she started hearing gasps ripple through the crowd, people asking how that was possible, demanding to know if the protagonist had really just blocked the attack because they couldn't believe what their eyes were seeing. Zhao Mu was holding Nudie by the horns, effortlessly. The bull stared at him and asked how that was possible. The protagonist tilted his head and asked if he forgot to eat today, because if that was all he could bring, this fight wasn't going to be any fun. Zhao Ran gritted her teeth and told Nudie to stop being an idiot and take the pill she'd given him. Right now, Nudie accepted without hesitation, saying the protagonist had forced his hand. The moment he bit into the pill, a massive surge of energy exploded from his body, forcing the protagonist to step back. Nudie roared that now he'd show his true form. The bull demon transformation activated. The protagonist stared. He was genuinely impressed. The transformation was complete. This was a completely different beast. Luki turned on Zhao Ran furiously, saying she was absolutely despicable. She couldn't believe she'd helped her fighter cheat in a sanctioned duel. But Zhao Ran just laughed and asked how that could possibly be considered cheating. What he'd taken was a demon spirit pill, something that temporarily stimulated the power of the demonic bloodline. That power already existed within Nudie because he was born of the demonic race. The pill simply awakened what was already his. Where exactly was the cheating? Nudie prepared to attack, declaring that this time he would tear the protagonist to pieces with the savage bull impact. The crowd went quiet with awe. He was moving so fast that most people could barely track him. But to the protagonist, it was still not fast enough. He read the movement and dodged. Though not perfectly, a scratch opened up along his arm. He noted it with interest. Even without a direct hit, the sheer pressure from the wind behind that attack had been enough to break skin. Nudie followed through and drove his head straight into the wall, shaking the entire gate on impact. The crowd murmured that strength was absolutely absurd. Nudie shook it off and came again, swearing the protagonist wouldn't dodge this time, but Zhao Mu was already done being patient. A slow smile crossed his face as he said his opponent really did have quite a lot of strength, but it simply wasn't enough. One strike, he shattered Nudie's horn clean off, and drove his fist straight in, and sent him sailing through the air. Zhao Ran's jaw dropped, she couldn't process it. The protagonist had just dropped the demonized Nudie in a single exchange. She asked herself, was the pure yang body really that powerful? And when had he even broken through to Foundation establishment, the force behind that punch had exceeded even Nudie's in his transformed state. Luki threw her arms around the protagonist, telling him he was incredible, and that she'd clearly underestimated just how strong he actually was. Zhao Mu told her to hold it together, there were a lot of people watching. Zhao Ran stared at Nudie crumpled on the ground and told him flatly that he was useless trash. She ordered her other subordinates to drag him away, but the protagonist told everyone to hold on a moment. The three of them tensed up, asking what else he wanted. He'd already crushed their boss. Zhao Mu reached into his storage and pulled out a bag of spirit stones, 10,000 inside. He said he was a reasonable man. Considerate payment for the medical expenses. Nudie's subordinates called him arrogant, saying they couldn't believe the level of disrespect. Meanwhile, two people nearby whispered to each other that if someone offered them 10,000 spirit stones, they'd accept the beating without a second thought. The system registered it, 10,000 spirit stones donated. Return, 100 times. He obtained 1 million spirit stones. He stared at that multiplier. Only 100 times, not exactly satisfying. Zhao Ran walked toward him, slow and deliberate, clapping. She told him he'd done very well, exactly what she expected of the man she'd set her eyes on. As a true lady, she said, she liked him even more now. If he came back to her side, she'd give him anything he wanted. Zhao Mi knocked her hand away and told her she wasn't even worthy of standing in his presence. Her aura flared, sharp, suffocating, dangerous, but before she could act, Luki stepped directly in front of her, telling her that the protagonist was a human being, not merchandise she could pick up and throw away whenever the mood struck her. And she promised she would challenge the path to heaven and surpass Zhao Ran's ranking. After that, she'd face her properly and make her answer for every bit of harm she'd caused the protagonist. Before they entered, Zhao Mu looked at Luki and told her that what she just said genuinely meant a lot to him. She laughed and said she was glad he liked it. The two walked in together to challenge the path to heaven. And Zhao Ran stood outside watching them go, absolutely seething. She swore to herself she would never let the two of them live in peace. People nearby were already talking. Zhao Ran held 9th place on the Outer Sex Pride of Heaven list. Rising star of the Fox tribe. And Luki was the granddaughter of the 12th Elder's noble by birth, and her beauty was every bit a match for Zhao Ran's. And yet both of these women were fighting over Zhao Mu. Meanwhile, deep within the sacred land of the demonic sect inside the 9-Dragon Sanctum, Tian Qiang was in the middle of secluded cultivation. When he sensed a presence, he attacked without hesitation, his strike cutting through everything in front of him, but the person hadn't been eliminated. Niwao, who had been watching everything unfold outside, approached Tian Qiang and said the outer sect was buzzing with rumors. Luki and Zhao Ran were apparently fighting over some pretty boy. He'd been worried it might end up damaging Tian Qiang's reputation, so he'd come to report it personally. Tian Qiang's eyes went cold. He asked, this man really came here to interrupt his secluded cultivation over something this trivial. Niwao went pale. He stepped back immediately, apologizing and saying he hadn't meant to intrude, but Tian Qiang told him to wait. Niwao froze, trembling, and asked if there was something else. Then a devastating strike hit him out of nowhere and sent him flying. Niwao scrambled to his feet, terrified, demanding to know why he'd been attacked. Tian Qiang told him to stop panicking and look at his chest. Niwao looked down and saw a mark had appeared on his skin. Tian Qiang explained that it was a strand of sword intent he had condensed. Niwao, still shaken, asked what exactly that meant. Tian Qiang said it simply, there were always ants that didn't know their place, so Niu Ao needed to go out there and remove that ant for him. Niu Ao felt the power coursing through him from the embedded sword intent and thanked him for it. Meanwhile, on the path to heaven, Luki explained that the path to heaven automatically recorded how many floors a disciple could climb, and since this was the protagonist's first time, they'd be separated at the entrance. Zhao Miu said he understood, but two of them stood there for a moment, a little shy. And Luki kissed him for good luck. She told him to be careful. The protagonist just smiled and said the one who should be careful was her. He continued on alone, and almost immediately ran into several enormous monsters, blocking his path entirely. All of them came at him simultaneously, but he dodged every single one of them. Genuinely surprised, he thought Foundation Establishment staged demonic beasts on the very first floor. Newly arrived outer sect disciples would have absolutely no way through this. The monsters pressed in again. He dodged all of them a second time and told them all right, now it was his turn to play. He pushed forward against the pack and the beasts actually flinched, thrown off by the sheer pressure he was releasing. With a single strike, he dropped all three monsters at once. He said it out loud, that was far too easy. The path to heaven announced that level 1 was complete and he could choose one of 3 rewards. He looked at the options and landed on an upper-level yellow grade technique, the blazing flame palm. His face lit up. He'd been quietly worried about not having a combat technique compatible with the Crimson Yang sacred body, and here it was, showing up at exactly the right moment. He chose it without hesitation and immediately began studying it. First, guide the true solar fire into the body, then reinforce the strike with the full strength of the radiant sun. He tested it on a pile of stones nearby. They disintegrated. He nodded, satisfied he'd already got the hang of it. Time for level 2. Meanwhile, on the third level, Luki was fighting hard, giving everything she had, and cleared the stage. Outside, people were gathered around the ranking board in disbelief. Luki had broken into the top 50, passed the third level, and was already heading into the fourth. The record on the fourth level was held by the outer sect's top prodigy, Nalan Chuan, who had held on for a full hour. If Luki could last even 15 minutes, she'd crack the top 10 of the Pride of Heaven list. And suddenly, the protagonist's name appeared on the board. People stared. He'd entered the top 1,000 just by finishing the first level, and his clear time was absurd. Some argued that since he'd already beaten Nudie, who had cleared the third level, it wasn't that surprising. Others still couldn't wrap their heads around it. Zhao Ran was getting more and more irritated by the second, muttering that the two of them had clearly been dual cultivating a lot over the past few days. Then Nalan Chuan arrived and the crowd immediately reacted. He was the #1 prodigy of the outer sect and carried the Kilin bloodline. The guys in the crowd weren't exactly thrilled, given that he was both incredibly talented and annoyingly handsome, though his arrogance had absolutely no ceiling. Chuan glanced at the two people talking about him. It activated his bloodline, dropping both of them in under a second. He kept walking and said plainly that he hated people who talked about him behind his back. He spotted Zhao Ran, already irritated, and she immediately asked what he was doing there. Chuan told her he'd heard her little boyfriend had run off with another girl. He was only there to laugh in her face. Zhao Ran's composure cracked completely. She asked if he wanted to die and moved on him, but before the situation could escalate into an actual fight, Yu Lao appeared and grabbed both of their arms. He was currently ranked in the top 10 of the Intersex Pride of Heaven list, a cultivator at the peak of core formation. Zhao Ran asked if he was there to avenge what happened to his cousin, and reminded him to be careful about picking a fight with someone under the protection of the 12th Elder's granddaughter. Niu Ao showed the mark on his chest and said that this time he had direct authorization from Tian Qiang himself. He had nothing to fear. Nalan Chuan's grin widened. He said it looked like the trip had been worth it after all. A newly arrived outer sect disciple going up against someone at the peak of core formation, that was going to be very interesting to watch. While the three of them were still going back and forth, people in the crowd suddenly started shouting. The protagonist had already climbed into the top 200. That was beyond comprehension. He was moving through the ranks at a pace nobody could explain, back on the path to heaven's second level. The protagonist was running through the blazing flame palm and tearing through every monster in the room with zero effort. The path to heaven announced level 2 complete and gave him 3 reward options. He looked them over. Blade techniques were useless to him right now, and origin nourishment pills were practically candy at this point. So the third option it was. He selected the grade 2 flying sword, the white jade radiance. He climbed toward the next floor, muttering that the sword's grade was so low it wasn't even worth a second glance. He'd find someone to pass it on to later. The moment he reached the third level, he stopped and said out loud this place was absolutely packed. Now he understood why most outer sect disciples couldn't clear the third level until they'd reached core formation. Even so, he'd made it this far. He needed to test his limits even if he couldn't get through. He launched into the crowd of monsters with the blazing flame palm running at full force. He knocked some of them down, but the rest were moving way too fast. He felt one closing in and thought this was it. Then on pure instinct, he kicked out with his other leg and connected. He shattered the beast's teeth. He looked himself over after taking what was nearly a direct hit, a few superficial scratches. That was it. He stared at his own hands, quietly stunned by just how durable the Crimson Yang sacred body actually was. The monsters swarmed in again. But now that he knew he was basically unkillable, he started dismantling them one by one with total ease. With a physique like this, he might actually be able to push through. He kept going, bulldozing through everything the third level threw at him. His clothes were shredded and soaked in blood. Then his body and clothing began to restore themselves. He realized, under the constant reinforcement of his Crimson Yang power, his physique had not only become far more resistant to damage, but was now recovering at a completely absurd rate. Which made him wonder, maybe the fourth level wasn't out of the question after all. The Path to Heaven announced level 3 complete and offered him 3 rewards. He already knew the rules, pills, and artifacts obtained inside couldn't be used while still within the Path to Heaven. So if he was going to push into the fourth level, his only real option was to pick a new technique. He sat down and began cultivating right there. There was no time limit inside the Path to Heaven. He'd tackle the fourth level once he had the technique down. Outside, the crowd couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some people suggested there must have been an error. Others immediately shut that down. The Heavenly Ascension Matrix was personally created by the Sacred Origin Patriarch, and in 8,000 years it had never made a single mistake. The protagonist was already ranked 13th, and nobody could explain how. What kind of monster had he become? He'd cleared the third level in 15 minutes flat, and even if that wasn't a record time, he was still only at the 5th stage of Foundation establishment. A core formation cultivator challenging the third level might not even clear it at that speed. Zhao Ran was still trying to work out what kind of opportunity that boy had stumbled into to grow this fast. Niu Ao told everyone to quiet down, pointing out that this was only the Outer Sect's Pride of Heaven list, and yet they were already carrying on like this. The Outer Sect really was full of people with nothing better to do. Then Luki came out. She'd lasted 15 minutes on the 4th level, which put her at 9th place. Bumping Zhao Ran down to 10th, people rushed to congratulate her. She said it was nothing. Zhao Ran said she'd only climbed a few positions and was already acting proud. Luki smiled and agreed, yes, only a few positions, but already enough to stand above a certain fox. Zhao Ran snapped back that it didn't matter whether she'd been surpassed or not. Niu Ao was here from the inner sect to settle something, so Luki wouldn't be able to shield Zhao Mu this time. Luki looked at Niu Ao and immediately placed him, Nudi's cousin. He was here because of Nudi, but his eyes were fixed entirely on Zhao Mu. Meanwhile, inside, the protagonist had just finished his cultivation session. He opened his eyes and tested his newly learned technique, the purple lightning bind. The impact it produced was enormous. He noted that lightning attribute techniques were significantly harder to master than most. Without his boosted comprehension, understanding the basics in half an hour would have been completely impossible. But the range on the purple lightning bind was wide, which made it perfect for dealing with multiple enemies at once. He stood up, cracked his neck, and said he'd rested long enough. Time to see what was waiting for him on the 4th level. He stepped through the threshold and found only a single beast on the other side. One, but the pressure radiating from it was suffocating. He had no choice but to go all in. The monster lunged. He dodged, but not cleanly. It was faster than expected, and it opened a wound on him. He spotted an opening and launched the blazing flame palm. The beast sidestepped it. Way too fast, he couldn't land a clean hit. He switched tactics. If he could paralyze it first, maybe he'd get his window. The purple lightning bind connected, freezing the monster in midair. He charged in immediately and swung his strongest palm strike, but the beast twisted its body in the air and the attack missed. It retaliated instantly, and before he could react, it took his arm clean off. He stared at the beast, the severed arm in its jaws, and thought clearly, from the looks of it, this was the end. He'd accept it. Then the system activated. It announced that the host had offered himself as food to a fierce beast, and because of that, a 10,000 times return had been triggered. A new arm grew back from the stump, and his entire body began to transform. He had obtained the human emperor bloodline. He stared at the notification in disbelief. A 10,000 times return and the human emperor bloodline. The system began explaining that according to legend, at the beginning of time, 10,000 races were born simultaneously, and an age of war for supremacy began. The human race was pushed to the edge, nearly driven to extinction. But at that critical moment, supreme powerhouses rose from among humanity. They annihilated every enemy that dared to stand against the human race. They pushed their bodies and bloodlines far beyond their limits, reaching combat power that defied all reason. And in doing so, they turned the tide, defeating enemies that should have been unbeatable and ensuring humanity's survival. The protagonist felt something ignite inside him. He thought maybe one day he would walk among the stars and drive out every last invader himself. With the human emperor bloodline now awakened, a dense and overwhelming aura radiated from his entire body. He unleashed a single strike and destroyed half the arena. The beast actually flinched. He asked the leopard did it still want to play. The leopard, visibly shaken, charged anyway, but now the protagonist just smiled. The leopard had become noticeably slower than before. He weaved through its attacks without a care. It with one final blow split the leopard clean in half. The path to heaven announced level 4 complete and presented 3 reward options. A grade 4 wind path pill, a grade 4 magic treasure called the cold descent spear, and a mid-level mystic grade technique called the great expansion monument hand. The protagonist said all 3 were genuinely impressive, but unfortunately he could only pick one. He took the pill, planning to hand it off to someone outside, because outside was absolutely going to be chaos right now. Sure enough, people were already shouting that his ranking had shifted again. Number 1 on the Outer Sex Pride of Heaven list, Zhao Mu had taken the top spot. Luki covered her mouth, eyes wide, saying he'd actually done it. Zhao Ran stood completely still trying to understand what kind of creature that boy had become. Niu Ao was also shaken. He muttered that reaching the top while only being at the 5th stage of foundation establishment was impossible by any normal standard. This had to be cut off at the root immediately. If they let him keep growing, nobody would be able to stop him. The protagonist stepped into the 5th level and found 5 great demons waiting, middle stage of golden core, all 5. That was already too much. He looked at them, thought about it for exactly 1 second and surrendered on the spot, telling the monsters they didn't need to do anything. He knew his limits. One of the monsters tried to swipe at him anyway. He stepped back and told it calmly to relax, saying that when he had the strength to back it up, he'd come back and challenge them properly. And that wouldn't take very long. The moment he stepped out, a crowd had already gathered around the exit. He looked at everyone and asked were they all here for him. Yu Ao released his aura and walked toward the protagonist, saying he'd been waiting a while. Luki and Zhao Ran both stepped in front of him. Luki warned the protagonist to be careful. That was Niu Ao, number 8 on the Inner Sex Pride of Heaven list. Zhao Ran told him to go and said the 2 of them would hold Niu Ao back. Zhao Mu looked between them, genuinely surprised. Luki stepping up for him made complete sense, but Zhao Ran, he didn't see that coming. She told him she had her own reasons. Niu Ao assessed the situation and concluded that for both of them to be shielding that boy this instinctively, the people behind them must have already recognized his potential. He couldn't afford to drag this out. The elders might show up at any moment. Niu Ao advanced and shoved both women aside, saying no one was going to stop him. He was there to avenge his cousin. Zhao Mu rolled his shoulders and smiled, saying he'd just finished warming up. Now he could actually test what a cultivator at the peak of core formation was made of. He charged forward, the human emperor bloodline blazing to life. The collision sent shockwaves rolling outward. The crowd erupted, asking each other if that was really someone at the 5th stage of foundation establishment, directly taking hits from a peak core formation expert. And that light burning from his body was that the human emperor bloodline. Zhao Mu had caught Niu Ao's full-strength punch with one hand. He told him plainly with raw strength alone, Niu Ao wasn't going to win this. Niu Ao stared at him, rattled. He thought how many more secrets was this brat hiding? He couldn't hold anything back anymore. He moved to throw the protagonist off him. Both women screamed at Zhao Mu to run. Niu Ao roared that he would die under sword intent right here. He lived long enough. Zhao Mu tried to pull back, but the sword intent moved faster than he could retreat. He recognized it the instant it touched him, Tian Qiang's sword intent. He activated the human emperor bloodline again, throwing everything he had into defense. Telling himself to hold firm, the explosion that followed was massive. Luki screamed his name. Zhao Ran told her it was pointless, because that was the sword intent of a nascent soul cultivator. At Foundation Establishment, the protagonist should have been turned to dust. She thought coldly that now she'd never be able to finish her mission. Irritating. Niu Ao laughed, saying this was exactly what happened when someone didn't know their place and dared to offend someone truly great. Luki's expression cracked. Then they heard coughing. From the smoke and debris, the protagonist emerged, completely wrecked, clothes in tatters but smiling. He asked if that was really that brat's sword intent, because honestly it wasn't that impressive. One of his arms was gone. Niu Ao couldn't process it. Anyone else should have ceased to exist. He pressed forward anyway, saying the protagonist was already at his limit. This ends now. Luki moved to intervene, but Niu Ao threw her aside and told her to get out of the way. Zhao Mu stood there, running on empty. His body had nothing left to give. Then an overwhelming pressure crashed down on Niu Ao, driving him straight into the ground. He looked up and demanded to know who had dared to interfere. The Saintess Zixuan descended and told him it was her. She asked if anyone had any objections. Niu Ao immediately dropped to his knees, saying he would never dare question her decision. But he did ask with all due respect why the Saintess had come here. Everyone around them bowed. Zixuan looked at the protagonist. She said she was genuinely surprised he'd reached #1 on the Outer Sex Pride of Heaven list. That wasn't worth bragging about on its own, of course. Even so, doing it at his current cultivation stage made him the only person in the entire 8,000-year history of the demonic sect of the Sacred Origin to have achieved it. And thanks to his absurd regeneration, the protagonist had basically already recovered. He laughed and said it was just luck. Zixuan extended her hand toward him and asked would he accept her as his master. Before he could answer, 3 other elders arrived in a rush, shouting that they'd heard a supreme human prodigy had appeared in the outer sect and demanding to see him with their own eyes. The Sword Elder told the other 2 not to even think about competing with him. He'd gone 800 years without accepting a disciple, holding out specifically for a human prodigy like this. The other 2 weren't backing down either. One disciple in the crowd looked up and quietly asked a friend who those old men were. His friend told him to watch his mouth. Those were the human elders of the demonic sect of the Sacred Origin. The 5th elder, Zhao Xiliang, squared up with the Saintess immediately, saying she'd already overstepped. It wasn't easy for the human race to produce a prodigy like this. How could they let the demonic side claim him? He was the 5th elder and a formation master. His mastery over formations was extraordinary. The 7th elder, Feng Deng, also stepped forward, reminding the Saintess that she'd already taken Mu Juling. She couldn't just take this human prodigy too. A renowned alchemist, his strength didn't draw much attention, but in the art of pills he had no equal. The 3rd elder, Dugu Qiang, cut through the noise and said simply, in the cultivation world, strength was the only thing that mattered. If the protagonist chose him as his master, he would give him a complete set of grade 7 or higher defensive Dharma treasures. And he would also pass on the art of battling heaven and earth, the technique he'd spent his entire life mastering. The very art that had carved him a path of slaughter straight into the depths of the ancient Forbidden Zone and earned him his position as the 3rd elder. People in the crowd stared at each other in disbelief. There were only 4 human elders in the entire demonic sect, and 3 of them had just shown up here at the same time. The protagonist's talent was something else entirely. Becoming a direct personal disciple was enough to make anyone envious. The Saintess and the 3 elders surrounded him, all 4 releasing their auras simultaneously, each asking who he was going to choose. Zhao Mu thought about it for a moment, then smiled and suggested that maybe he could choose all of them. The 3 elders stared at him. The Saintess laughed and said she had no objections. It was entirely up to the 3 elders. Xiliang frowned, saying that the formation master lineage required an absurd level of dedicated study. Dugu Qiang pointed out that building combat strength demanded constant training with no exceptions. Feng Deng added that becoming an alchemy master consumed enormous time, and splitting one's focus like that was simply not possible. The protagonist activated the human emperor bloodline and said how could he possibly disappoint the expectations of 3 great elders. His proposal was simple, 3 days with each of them separately, a trial period. If he could meet each elder's expectations in the shortest possible time, that would prove he could handle all 3 simultaneously. The 3 elders stared at the human emperor bloodline burning in front of them. The Saintess smiled and said, "It's decided then." She turned and left, taking Niuao with her, saying she would personally handle the explanation for what had occurred here. The protagonist thanked her sincerely for everything she'd done, and thought to himself the Saintess really was a good person. He raised his voice after her and said if she ever needed his help with cultivation in the future, he would hold absolutely nothing back. He'd make sure she felt like the most cherished woman in the world. Zixuan's composure slipped just slightly. She told him they'd discuss that later and kept walking. Elder Xiliang grabbed the protagonist and told him this was no time for idle chatting. They were heading straight to formation training. The protagonist agreed. He said goodbye to Luki and told her to be careful around Tian Qiang. She waved him off and told him not to worry. Everyone else just watched. But among the crowd, one person stood out. The cultivator who had originally captured Zhao Mu, standing there in complete shock, thinking that the brat had really become a genuine personal disciple. From the looks of it, staying in the demonic sect was no longer an option. But then he thought more carefully. The rest of his family was still inside the demonic sect of the Sacred Origin. There was no way they could simply vanish. He'd heard that the Daxia dynasty, where Zhao Mu had come from, was now being threatened by the neighboring Great Zhou dynasty and was on the verge of total collapse. If his family could somehow help save the Daxia dynasty, that would be an enormous favor to Zhao Mu. and maybe, just maybe, the protagonist would show enough mercy to spare them. He took to the sky, telling himself this was a solid plan. He needed to find his father and explain everything right away. Not long after, at Mystic Formation Peak, the two arrived, and Elder Siliang explained that this was his formation valley, 3,270 formations spread across the entire area. It also served as the core of the mountain protection formation for the demonic sect of the Sacred Origin. When fully activated, this place became the most secure location in the entire sect. The protagonist looked around and asked, did that also mean the formations on the path to heaven had been made by Elder Siliang? The elder looked almost offended. He said that even considering himself a great genius in formations, he could never create something as transcendent as the path to heaven, not if he spent his entire life trying. He explained that the path to heaven was personally constructed by the Sacred Origin Patriarch 8,000 years ago. And thanks to it, the demonic sect of the Sacred Origin had stood unmatched within the forest of 10,000 demons to this day. Zhao Mu quietly reflected on just how extraordinary the Patriarch must have been. He'd heard the Patriarch disappeared 1,000 years after founding the sect and wondered whether he was actually dead. The elder said honestly that he had no idea where the Patriarch was. Some believed he'd overcome his tribulation and ascended. Others claimed he'd uncovered an incredible secret and was now imprisoned by some unknown force, unable to escape to this day. The protagonist found that second theory unsettling. What kind of force could actually suppress someone like the Patriarch? Elder Silian told him it was far too early to be thinking about things like that. First, the cave. They needed to test his formation aptitude. He headed inside. A girl came out calling out to her master. She was Silian's disciple, Xing Yorong. She asked what he was doing at the cave today, but the protagonist's attention went elsewhere immediately. Certain things were very hard to ignore. Yorong noticed exactly where his eyes had wandered. He caught himself and looked away, internally telling himself he'd just embarrassed himself, almost losing his composure in front of his new senior sister. The elder introduced Zhao Mu, telling her this was her new junior brother. He then introduced her to the protagonist. While her cultivation wasn't particularly high, she was a genius in divine patterns, the kind that appeared maybe once a century. Zhao Mu tried to greet her politely. She was not particularly warm about it, given what he'd been staring at earlier. The elder told the two of them he'd leave them to it. He had some things to handle, so she could walk the protagonist through the basics of formation techniques for now. Yorong brought him inside and picked something up. He asked what it was. She told him it was a divine pattern disc. All he had to do was hold it and press it against the center of his forehead. She warned him not to use his eyes, he needed to feel it with his heart. Zhao Mu concentrated and suddenly, his consciousness was pulled somewhere else entirely. A massive disc stretched before him, filled wall to wall with symbols and markings. Yorong took the disc from his hand and told him that was enough. She asked if he'd seen anything. He described it, a large disc covered in strange symbols. Her expression shifted slightly. She asked how many symbols he'd seen, thinking to herself that being able to visualize the divine pattern disc on the very first attempt already showed real talent. No wonder the elder master had brought him here personally. Zhao Mu tried to recall the exact count and admitted he couldn't be precise, somewhere around 1,000 he thought, possibly a little more, but he was certain it wasn't 2,000. Yorong went still, over 1,000 divine patterns on the very first attempt. On her first try, she'd seen only a few dozen. Zhao Mu asked if those symbols were what they referred to as divine patterns. She explained that yes, that was exactly it. Everything in heaven and earth followed an underlying order, and what sustained that order were the divine patterns hidden throughout the corners of space. Divine patterns existed everywhere in an almost incomprehensible variety. Nobody knew for certain how many types existed in the world. She had spent her entire life studying formations, more than 30 years, and even after reaching grade 6 as a formation master, she had only mastered a little over 6,700 variations. The protagonist asked with genuine curiosity if she had really accomplished all that, and then, with slightly less tact, asked whether that meant his own formation aptitude was poor. Yorong felt a vain throb. He'd seen nearly 2,000 patterns on his first attempt and was somehow fishing for reassurance. She let it go and told him firmly, now that he'd managed to perceive divine patterns, the next step was learning to control them. He lit up and told her to show him exactly what to do. She told him to pay close attention, and suddenly the two of them were pulled into a subspace. He looked around in complete shock and asked if that was a formation. Yorong said it wasn't exactly a formation, but calling it that wasn't wrong either. She started demonstrating, telling him this represented her current level of strength. She could use the divine pattern disc to rearrange patterns and shape specific environments. But suddenly her head started to swim. He noticed immediately. He caught her before she could fall, asking if she was all right. She steadied herself and said she was fine. Manipulating divine patterns drew heavily on one's energy. She pulled herself together and told him he didn't need to hold her, she was already better. She explained the situation plainly. Even though her mastery over formations was strong, her aptitude and cultivation base were both low. She was stuck at the peak of foundation establishment with no way forward. Zhao Mu said that breaking through to core formation shouldn't be that difficult. Couldn't a grade 5 origin nourishment pill handle it? She shook her head. Even grade 6 pills did nothing for her. The elder master had told her that her purple mansion had been damaged from birth. Her meridians couldn't accumulate energy properly. Unless she could obtain a grade 8 origin gathering pill, she had no realistic path to core formation. Zhao Mu felt an idea forming. He called her name and said if he managed to get an origin gathering pill for her, what would she be willing to give him in return? Her eyes went wide. She said that if he could really produce a grade 8 origin gathering pill, she'd liquidate everything she owned, break open every single savings jar she had, and hand over every last coin. Zhao Mu told her gently that she probably already understood. A grade 8 origin gathering pill wasn't something money alone could buy. She went quiet for a moment, flushing slightly, then said if money wasn't enough, then she'd sell herself to him as well. The protagonist reached out and took her hand and sealed the deal without a second of hesitation. She stood there for a moment and thought she had a very strong feeling she just walked straight into a trap. Zhao Mu smiled and told her that as it happened, he had some origin gathering pills on him and he'd give them to her now. She takes a slow breath and accepts them, then her expression falls slightly when she sees they're all grade 5. She tells him they no longer have any effect on her. Still, she thanks him and says she'll hold onto the gift. The moment she accepted them, the system got to work. Grade 5 origin nourishment pill donated, return at 200 times. First reward, a grade 6 nourishment pill. Then the second pill triggered a 50 times return, a grade 5 heart nourishment pill. And the third, 3,000 times, he obtained a grade 8 origin gathering pill. He had to stop himself from laughing out loud. The pill had finally shown up, and from the looks of it, his senior sister wasn't going to be slipping out of his hands anytime soon. Then the ground shook. A deep rumble rolled through the valley, loud enough to rattle the walls. The protagonist snapped to attention and asked what was happening. Yorong told him it was the mountain protection formation. She snapped her fingers, and 3 people materialized in front of her. She asked them directly had they found the source of the damage to the formation. One of the 3 reported that all 3 damaged points had been caused by evil beasts. Weak traces of evil energy had been left at each location. They'd already reported it to the core of the sacred ground, and the Holy Sun had said he would personally investigate. Yorong thanked them and told them they'd done well, they could rest now. The 3 bowed and took their leave. The protagonist asked if something serious had happened. She told him it was nothing major, just some demonic activity. It wasn't unusual for a place like the demonic sect of the sacred origin. Zhao Mu asked, wasn't the demonic sect already a demonic faction? So why were there still outside evil entities causing trouble inside it? Yorong explained that since ancient times, the Jinwu continent had been split between 2 great factions, the human race and the demon race, and the 2 had always despised each other deeply. That made the position of the demonic sect of the sacred origin extraordinarily complicated. They weren't accepted by the demon race and they weren't trusted by the human race. No one knew how many factions simply saw them as a thorn that needed pulling out. The protagonist finally understood. With a situation like that, it wasn't strange at all that humans and demons struggled to coexist peacefully within the sect. They headed back to the lodging and she told him she'd burned through a lot of energy just now. She'd go upstairs to rest before continuing his lessons. He said that was completely fine. Before climbing the stairs, she turned back and told him clearly he was free to walk wherever he liked down here, but he was absolutely not allowed to go up there. Zhao Mu just watched her go and thought to himself he had a strong feeling that before long she'd be the one inviting him up. But that could wait. He wanted to rest too. He peeled off his clothes and slipped into the lake outside, sighing that the disciples of the demonic sect of the sacred origin really knew how to live. Even out here, there was a hot spring. He pulled up the system to check his status. 7 million spirit stones remaining. That sounded like a lot until he remembered just pushing to the 6th stage of foundation establishment would cost over 100 million. He was essentially broke. With 3 elders and the saintess behind him now, that cuckold Tian Qiang probably wouldn't have the nerve to make any open moves. But in the shadows, that was a different story. Which meant getting stronger fast was still the only real option. He looked up and decided he'd start with Yorong. The moment he set foot on the stairs, a magic circle lit up. Several weapons locked onto him instantly. From upstairs, Yorong asked what exactly he thought he was doing. He said innocently that he was only curious about what was up there, something about the fragrance was unusual and she shouldn't read too much into it. She called down from the bath telling him not to play dumb. She knew exactly what he was trying to pull. Either way, he wasn't getting up there. That upper floor had been sealed behind multiple layers of formations for a long time. Even someone at the nascent soul realm would have a hard time forcing their way through. Zhao Mu uncorked the bottle and called up to her, telling his senior sister she was mistaken. He had a feeling she'd be the one inviting him up herself. The moment the scent drifted upward, she left the bath in a hurry. She came straight to him, eyes locked on the grade 8 origin gathering pill in his hand. Meanwhile, the protagonist's eyes were locked somewhere else entirely. She grabbed his hand and demanded to know where he'd gotten it, telling him to let her see it properly. He stepped back. She switched tactics, voice soft, smile warm, and asked him sweetly to please just let her take a closer look. She only wanted to confirm it was real. Zhao Mu told her she could look but not touch, because if she got her hands on it, she might swallow the whole thing and then claim it was a fake. And with no pill left to examine, how was he supposed to argue? Yorong swore she would only look and wouldn't touch it without his permission, but mid-oath her towel slipped. The protagonist stared. She went red immediately and said that had absolutely nothing to do with the pill. Without clothes or a towel, she abandoned the negotiation entirely and told him to stop stalling and follow her upstairs. As she climbed ahead of him, he decided the view was worth every spirit stone he'd ever spent. Zhao Mu laughed and said, well, that certainly motivated him to head on up. Not long after, on the upper floor, he held the pill out in front of her and asked if she was done looking. Yorong declared without any hesitation, without a doubt, this was a genuine grade 8 origin gathering pill. She wasn't letting this opportunity slip away. She stepped closer and told him to name his price. Even if she had to give up everything she owned, she'd buy it. Zhao Mu told her honestly that money wasn't exactly what he needed right now. But there was something else, a scent in the air. He asked where it was coming from. She held up a plant and asked what he thought about trading it for the pill. The protagonist shook his head and said she was trying to lowball him. No matter how rare the orchid was, it wasn't worth more than a grade 8 origin gathering pill. Yorong explained it was no ordinary orchid. Its name was the immortal blue Ganoderma, an extraordinarily rare spiritual herb. Her father had obtained it by chance while searching an ancient secret realm specifically to find an origin gathering pill for her. Elder Feng had personally appraised it and confirmed it was a grade 8 spiritual herb, still in its growth phase. When it fully matured, she believed it might transcend the level of a spiritual herb entirely and become a priceless treasure-grade herb. Zhao Mu's eyes shifted. That was actually impressive. She pressed her advantage immediately. If he accepted the trade, she'd throw in another 50 million spirit stones on top. Zhao Mu thought it over. The orchid alone was already worth the deal, but judging by how eager she was, he had room to push further. He told her even granting that the orchid was genuinely valuable, the cost of nurturing it to treasure herb level would be astronomical. And given how long it could take to fully mature, he might not even be alive to see the day. Waiting hundreds of years was not part of his plan. Yorong's face fell slightly. He was right. The maturation timeline really was the problem. She stood up and said she had one more thing to offer. The protagonist asked what kind of benefit. She placed her hand on her chest and said, right here, and pulled off her own top. Zhao Mu blinked, then asked what exactly she thought she was doing and what kind of person she thought he was. Yorong immediately went red and told him he'd misunderstood everything. Look properly. The thing she'd removed began to transform into something else entirely. She explained it was a grade 7 defensive Dharma treasure her father had given her, called the Dragon Tendon Armor. Crafted from dragon tendons and scales, it could change form freely, and its defensive capability was absolute, capable of withstanding attacks from nascent soul experts for a sustained period. Zhao Mu took it carefully and said it was genuinely incredible. Was she really willing to give it up? Yorong pointed out that she spent essentially her entire year in the Formation Valley studying formations and rarely ventured anywhere dangerous. It wasn't like she was putting herself at great risk without it. Zhao Mu pulled off his shirt and fitted the armor onto himself, thanking her and telling her he'd take it. Yorong found her eyes drifting to his exposed torso and couldn't quite look away. She thought the body of a man could really be something else. As soon as the armor finished adapting to his build, he glanced over and caught her staring. She quickly looked elsewhere. He'd already noticed. He thought for a moment maybe now was a good time to put those spirit stones from the Saintess to work. Zhao Mu called her name and said he felt a little embarrassed. She'd already given him so much, so he wanted to return the spirit stones. She looked at him with some suspicion but accepted them. The The system flagged it immediately. 50 million spirit stones donated. Return 200 times. 10 billion spirit stones landed in his account. He could barely hold back the grin. Cultivation resources were no longer a concern. Zhao Mu told her he could feel his cultivation starting to stir. Was there a room nearby he could borrow for a while? She said he only needed to go out the door and turn right, but she couldn't stop staring at him. He'd just broken through and was already on the verge of breaking through again. What kind of monster was she dealing with? He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He told the system to begin cultivation, sat down, concentrated, and started burning through his spirit stones. 3 days later, Yorong was still sitting in the same spot, wondering how he was getting along in there. Meanwhile, inside the room, cultivation had been running non-stop until suddenly a burst of overwhelming energy tore through his body. 8th stage of foundation establishment. His entire physique had transformed. He said out loud that the 10 billion spirit stones had been exactly enough to reach the 8th stage. His constitution was genuinely frightening. Then he heard a voice outside asking if he'd broken through again. Elder Siliang stepped in, looking pleased, calling him an excellent disciple and asking how the past few days had treated him. The protagonist greeted him respectfully and reported that his senior sister had already taught him quite a lot, mainly foundational formation theory, and that he could already feel the fluctuations of divine patterns. Siliang shook his head and said that wasn't what he meant. The protagonist looked confused and asked what he was referring to. The elder asked plainly, what did the protagonist think of Yorong? Did he like her? Zhao Mu was caught completely off guard by that question coming from the elder master himself. Siliang told him not to look so startled. There was something important he needed to understand. That girl's background was far from simple. She had come from deep within the forest of 10,000 demons and belonged to the bear tribe. Her father was a powerhouse at the Tribulation Transcendence realm, someone with enormous influence across the entire demon race. If Zhao Mu could marry Yorong, he'd be saving himself roughly 1,000 years of effort. The protagonist laughed and said his focus right now was cultivation. Romance wasn't exactly a priority. Though privately he thought with the system giving him such an enormous edge already, he wasn't about to abandon an entire forest just for one tree. Then a voice boomed from outside, calling Siliang's name and demanding he hand over the disciple already. Siliang sighed and said Feng Deng was never late when it came to things like this. He handed the protagonist 3 books and told him even while training elsewhere he was not allowed to neglect his formation studies. He needed to read these regularly. Zhao Mu thanked the elder sincerely and promised he'd get to them as soon as he could. Elder Feng Deng looked the protagonist up and down and said, judging by the look on his face, he clearly wasn't cut out for formation study. And while the path of alchemy also demanded talent and comprehension, its requirements weren't as extreme. Especially given Zhao Mu's pure yang body, as long as he mastered fire control, refining pills would yield twice the results with half the effort. Siliang cut in and told Feng Deng to stop selling himself. The protagonist had perceived over 1,000 divine patterns on his very first contact with the divine pattern disc. That kind of talent appeared once every 1,000 years. Feng Deng's eyebrows shot up. He admitted being able to see over 1,000 divine patterns on first contact was genuinely staggering. That had probably never happened in the 8,000-year history of the demonic sect of the sacred origin. But they could debate that later, because if the protagonist's talent for alchemy was even more extreme, they needed to find out immediately. Off to the Alchemy Valley. Yoram watched them leave. A faint warmth on her face, the Grade 8 Origin Gathering pill held carefully in both hands. Not long after, in the Alchemy Valley, the two arrived. Feng Deng asked if the protagonist had ever studied any fire attribute techniques. Zhao Mu said yes, though not in any great depth. The elder led him inside and pointed to a furnace. He said, perfect. All the protagonist had to do was use his fire attribute to heat the alchemy furnace. Feng Deng would continuously add medicinal herbs. The protagonist only needed to regulate the temperature so nothing turned to ash. Zhao Mu said he understood and promised to do his best. He started feeding fire into the furnace, but Feng Deng's eyes went wide. He thought to himself this pure yang fire was extraordinary. But on closer inspection, it wasn't just pure yang fire, it looked like true solar fire. The highest grade of flame in the world of alchemy. This boy's aptitude was even greater than he had imagined. The pill was finished in almost no time at all. Feng Deng laughed loudly, saying that refining a superior grade pill on the very first attempt made the protagonist a prodigy among millions. The protagonist told his master he might be exaggerating slightly. The elder said he wasn't, and if he wasn't mistaken, the protagonist had awakened the Crimson Yang sacred body. Only the Crimson Yang sacred body could manifest true solar fire of that purity. Zhao Mu confirmed it. Though he added that he'd only ever used fire for the blazing flame palm, his actual control over it was still fairly rough. Feng Deng told him that didn't matter. The Alchemy Valley had no shortage of experts in fire attribute techniques. He could go through the available techniques, pick whatever suited him best, and train from there. They headed to the scripture pavilion, and the moment the protagonist stepped inside, he stopped and stared. The sheer volume of pills stored in that place was almost incomprehensible. It looked like the demonic sect's entire warehouse had been moved there. Feng Deng explained those were just recently refined lower-grade pills. Grade 5 and above were stored in the treasure pavilion at the central sacred ground. The elder browsed the shelves and gathered a selection of techniques. He handed them over and said they were all Earth grade. The protagonist could choose from among them. Yellow and Mystic grade probably wouldn't hold his interest. Zhao Mu looked through them. The Crimson Flame Tyrant Classic, the Scarlet Flame Hegemon Scripture, the Earth Abyss Fire, the Burning Woodblood Rainbow, and the Endless Life Art. Part of him wanted to take all 5, but too much greed brought too much trouble. He thought it through. The Scarlet Flame Hegemon Scripture was an intensely pure, overwhelmingly dominant fire technique, not ideal for alchemy but exceptional in combat. The Endless Life Art, on the other hand, strengthened medicinal herbs during refinement and could also close wounds. Both had real value. He made his decision, those two. The elder raised an eyebrow and walked over, saying it wasn't bad for a young cultivator to be bold and fearless. But he had a warning. If Elder Dugu Qiang tried to drag the protagonist off to train in the forest of 10,000 demons, he needed to resist. That man was famous for being completely reckless. He'd throw the protagonist headfirst into a nest of demonic beasts and call it a training exercise without blinking. Zhao Mu thanked his master and swore he'd keep that in mind. Feng Deng laughed and told him to just be careful. He hadn't taken on a disciple this promising only to watch him die young. While the two of them were talking, someone knocked on the door. A girl named Tao Subai stepped in and informed the master that the senior brother's residence had been prepared. She asked if there were any further instructions. Feng Deng introduced her to Zhao Mu, saying her name was Subai, and that going forward she'd assist the protagonist with his introduction to the Tao of Alchemy. As soon as the two of them left together, Zhao Mu mentioned that she must have become the elder's disciple before him, so why was she calling him senior brother? Subai explained that since the protagonist had just been accepted as a personal disciple, his standing was higher than that of the inner sect disciples. After a short walk, she stopped in front of a house and told him this was the personal disciple's residence. Clothing, food, and all daily necessities had already been prepared. She also mentioned that she lived nearby, so if he needed anything at all, he only had to call and she'd be there immediately. The protagonist smiled and asked, anything at all. He leaned a little closer, one hand settling at her waist, and asked if she'd even come warm his bed a little. He knew the girl was far too serious, he couldn't help himself. Subai's expression went flat. She told him to stop talking nonsense. Because while she called him senior brother, if it came down to raw strength alone, she could crush him with one hand. Zhao Mu straightened up immediately and said that was a joke, clearly a joke. She turned and left without another word. But Zhao Mu stood there and quietly processed what he'd just felt from her aura. It was even more oppressive than Niu Ao's, who was already half a step from nascent soul. This woman was either at the nascent soul stage or dangerously close to it. He followed her again as she led him to a furnace. After walking him through the basics, she told him that if anything was still missing, he just needed to say so. This time, Zhao Mu kept it professional, no jokes. He thanked her and said he'd let her know. He looked around and admitted the environment was genuinely pleasant and the supplies were all in order. He picked up a guide and started flipping through it, muttering that even grade 1 pill formulas were absurdly complicated. Then he threw the book down and said, forget it. Reading theory was useless. He needed to get his hands dirty. Besides, this was the perfect chance to test the two techniques he just picked up. He started by loading the medicinal herbs into the furnace. Then he combined the Scarlet Flame Hegemon Scripture and the Endless Life Art simultaneously, and began heating the furnace with both techniques running at once. The fire immediately started going out of control. He caught it just in time and pushed all his concentration into holding the temperature steady. 3 pills formed. He looked at them. A little rough around the edges, but for a first solo attempt combining 2 techniques at once, the result was already better than expected. Elsewhere, Elder Feng Deng was watching everything through a formation mirror and muttered that the boy was genuinely a monster. Talent in both formations and alchemy at that level, completely absurd. Elder Dugu Qiang appeared beside him and said, even so, the protagonist had cleared the 4th level of the path to heaven while still at foundation establishment. His true talent was combat. And that was exactly what made him so curious to see how the boy would perform in the blood battle hall. Feng Deng acknowledged it. Humans had always held the edge over the demon race in alchemy and formations. But in direct combat, the difference in constitution and bloodline almost always crushed that advantage. That was exactly why he truly hoped this boy's appearance could reignite something in the human cultivators who had carried that resentment for so long. 3 days later, the protagonist was completely wiped out. He was sitting in the middle of a mountain of pills, muttering that he was almost done. Most of them were ordinary grade 1 pills, but a decent number had come out with fairly respectable quality. For where he was right now, that was more than good enough. Then a knock at the door. Subai entered carrying a bowl of special spiritual porridge from the Alchemy Valley. She said it helped restore both spiritual energy and physical stamina. Zhao Mu grabbed it immediately, thanking her and saying she'd shown up at exactly the right moment. He was running on empty. Subai glanced past him to the side of the room and froze. She asked, did he refine all of that? He said yes. He added almost casually that the quality was probably a bit low. The fire from his pure yang body ran too hot and controlling the temperature was still a challenge. Subai thought he absolutely wasn't even trying to show off. That made it worse. She admitted somewhat reluctantly that as the elder's personal disciple, the protagonist really was an alchemy prodigy, but she added that if he had any alchemy questions, he shouldn't ask her. She wasn't an alchemist. Zhao Mu looked at her with fresh curiosity. Not an alchemist living in the Alchemy Valley, radiating the aura of a nascent soul expert. There was definitely a story there. He shifted slightly closer and said he'd been fairly rude earlier and unfortunately hadn't had a proper chance to apologize. He placed a small bag on her tray and told her to consider it a token of his sincerity. He genuinely hoped she'd accept it. Subai looked at it for a moment, then accepted. The system tallied it up. Grade 4 Wind Steps pill donated, return 1,000 times. He obtained a Grade 7 Wind Steps pill. The 30 Grade 4 Foundation Establishment pills he'd also included triggered a 300 times return. He obtained a Grade 7 Spiritual Gathering pill. He thought to himself, beauty, terrifying strength, and generous system returns. He definitely needed to find reasons to come back here more often. Then Elder Feng Ding called for him to come outside. He stepped out and greeted his master. Feng Ding told him there was no need for formalities. He'd seen the progress made over the past few days, but now it was time to follow Elder Dugu Qiang to the Blood Battle Hall. Zhao Mu noticed that Dugu Qiang looked worn and asked if something had happened. The elder said he'd had to deal with some clueless trash, and lately the situation near the sect had been getting increasingly unstable. The demon race stirring in the forest of 10,000 demons was becoming harder to ignore. He'd originally planned to take the protagonist out there for training today, but the timing no longer felt right. Zhao Mu recalled what Yorong had mentioned, demonic entities trying to sabotage the mountain protection formation. From the looks of it, whatever was happening out there had now escalated to the point where an elder had to personally step in. Dugu Qiang told him to come along. The Blood Battle Hall it was. Zhao Mu agreed, quietly noting that the demonic sect of the Sacred Origin had not been a peaceful place lately. He said goodbye to his alchemy master. Feng Deng waved him off, mentioning he might enter seclusion over the next few months to focus on pill refinement. If the protagonist returned to the Alchemy Valley while he was in seclusion and needed anything, he could find Subai. As soon as the two left, Subai told her master that this time he'd genuinely found a rare genius. Feng Deng chuckled and said his eye for talent had never let him down. The Blood Battle Hall was one of the oldest institutions in the sect, practically as old as the sect itself. The disciples who trained there had always carried the responsibility of standing on the front lines. If the demonic sect of the Sacred Origin had survived to the present day, it was because of the countless battles those disciples had fought and bled through over the centuries. Dugu Qiang put it simply, while the Great Formation protected the sect from within, the Blood Battle Hall was the spear pointed outward. They eliminated threats before those threats ever reached the sect's doorstep. After hearing all of that, the protagonist raised an honest question. They were the demonic sect, so acting this righteously felt somewhat out of character. Dugu Qiang asked him directly in his mind, was the demonic sect just a faction full of unscrupulous villains? Zhao Mu said, well, he had been kidnapped by an outer sect disciple of the demonic sect of the Sacred Origin, so. Dugu Qiang acknowledged it. That was more or less the image the outside world had of them. It had developed because they'd lived in isolation within the forest of 10,000 demons for a very long time, with almost no contact with other factions. In reality, neither the human race nor the demon race truly understood the intention behind what the Sacred Origin Patriarch had built here. Zhao Mu asked, did the Sacred Origin Patriarch really have a specific reason for founding the sect in that location? Dugu Qiang simply said, we've arrived. Inside the Blood Battle Hall, disciples were training in every direction. The protagonist took one look at the auras in that room and said these people were the real deal, worthy of the blood battle hall. Then two people walked in. The man was Yao Wugui. The woman was Xing Ziyu. The elder introduced them. Wugui was the protagonist's senior brother, currently ranked 9th on the Pride of Heaven list, and the woman beside him was his second senior sister, Ziyu. The protagonist greeted them both. Then the elder turned to Wugui and told him to go fetch the infinite bell. Wugui looked surprised and asked if that was really necessary. Duguqiang asked if Wugui was really suggesting that his personal disciple wasn't qualified to be tested by the infinite bell. Wugui immediately apologized and said he'd never dared think that, he'd go get it right now. But before leaving, he shot Zhao Mu a look, not a friendly one. Zhao Mu said he'd just arrived and already managed to annoy Wugui. Ziyu told him not to worry about it, that guy had a complicated temperament. Then she smoothly changed the subject, took his arm and said she'd heard around that he possessed a pure yang body. So, he must be especially impressive in that department. The protagonist blinked and asked if she was seriously asking that. He also pointed out that they'd literally just met and asked if she didn't think that was a little forward. Ziyu burst out laughing and said he was far too entertaining. She only wanted to feel what a pure yang body actually felt like up close. But unfortunately for him, she was already a married woman. He'd arrived too late. Zhao Mu was caught off guard by that, but he recovered and smiled, saying she looked very young and he hadn't expected her to have married so early. Ziyu said she was actually over 200 years old and she hadn't been married just once. Unfortunately, all 9 of her husbands had lived very short lives. If she thought about it carefully, she was practically middle-aged at this point, and yet she'd never once experienced the kind of pleasure that came from a truly powerful young man. Zhao Mu stared at her. 9 husbands. All dead, he asked flat out, was she a black widow? Ziyu laughed and pulled him into a hug again. Telling him to relax, she'd just been teasing him a little. She was 27 years old, still perfectly intact. Zhao Mu exhaled and said, so she really loved to joke around. But privately he thought not a single word out of this woman's mouth was probably true. Then the two came back with the infinite bell and the elder told Ziyu to stop tormenting the new junior brother. Zhao Mu asked what the infinite bell was for. The elder explained it was a trophy claimed after fighting through an ancient secret realm. Bell was damaged but still retained the power of a grade 1 Dao treasure. It could no longer be used in combat, but it still held one unique ability. It could test a cultivator's potential. Before transmitting the art of battling heaven and earth, the elder wanted to verify the protagonist's bone talent first. That was what the test was for. Zhao Mu said he understood. He walked toward the bell. The elder told him to use everything he had and strike it with full force. The protagonist steadied himself and drove his fist into the bell with everything he could channel. Sound waves that erupted from it left everyone in the hall completely still, but the waves didn't stop there. They traveled far beyond the hall, rolling outward across practically the entire continent. In a distant place, a being opened his eyes. He said quietly, it seemed the human emperor had finally appeared. When the young lady learned of this, she would be very happy, but unfortunately it was already too late. Everything had been set in motion and no one could change what was coming. Deep within the forest of 10,000 demons, a demon asked if everyone else had felt that. He said it plainly, the human emperor had been born. The Jinwu continent was about to change completely. One of the others pushed back, asking how one person could possibly reshape the world, especially one who had apparently been sealed. What trick could change anything at this stage? Another demon agreed, suggesting they pay their respects to the old ancestor and return to seclusion. The ancestor must have felt it too, and since he'd given no instructions, there was nothing to act on. The third said flatly that he'd never dare disturb the venerable elder. Anyone who wanted answers could go ask personally. The first demon told everyone to be quiet. He said the human emperor had been born. It was only a matter of time before he could no longer remain hidden. Because of that, each of them needed to send scouts out to investigate the situation. Back at the Blood Battle Hall, the protagonist asked his master, was that good enough? Duguqiang laughed and said it would do. Though quietly he thought to produce a resonance that size, this boy's bone talent had to be something the world hadn't seen in a very long time. Ziyu nudged Wugui and said she remembered his test results being significantly less impressive. Wugui immediately said he hadn't been using full strength that day. The elder told the protagonist there was no longer any need for further bone testing. He could begin training in the art of battling heaven and earth. The so-called art of battling heaven and earth wasn't simply a sequence of movements, it was a battle intent. A state of mind. From this point on, the protagonist needed to pay close attention to the changes in his master's aura. The elder would demonstrate it once, only once. Duguqiang drew a slow breath and began releasing his full power, a tremendous aura building around him like a gathering storm. That aura kept rising, shifting, taking on new shapes as it expanded. Then, in a single movement, he struck, and a colossal pillar of energy tore upward. After the demonstration ended, he looked at the protagonist and asked what he'd managed to grasp. Zhao Mu said the art of battling heaven and earth was the power to dominate all things. The elder looked at him for a long moment and said that reaching that level of comprehension was already very good, but the protagonist's face fell. Clearly, his master wasn't fully satisfied. He muttered that if he'd known, he would have waited until core formation to improve his comprehension first. Dugu Qiang told him there was no need to rush. The art of battling heaven and earth was better tempered through real combat than through theory. The more life-and-death battles the protagonist survived, the stronger that technique would naturally become. And there was one more thing. He handed over another technique, telling him to learn this one first. It should raise his combat power quickly. The name was the Sacred Origin Art. Zhao Mu immediately asked if it had any connection to the Sacred Origin Patriarch. Dugu Qiang confirmed it. The Sacred Origin Art had been personally created by the Patriarch himself, and while it wasn't a heavenly-grade technique, cultivated to its peak, it might not fall short of one at all. The protagonist's interest sharpened. He told the elder he'd give it everything he had. Dugu Qiang said over the next few days he could stay here and push that technique as far as he could. He glanced at Wu Gui and Ziyu and told them both no, causing trouble for their junior brother. He was looking at Ziyu specifically. The two said they understood and told him not to worry. The protagonist settled into one of the residences. He held the technique scroll and said out loud this was exactly what an upper-level Earth-grade technique felt like. Even with his current comprehension, working through it was a grind. But from what he could parse, the Sacred Origin Art wasn't a combat technique. It was an amplification art designed to strengthen spiritual power. And what made it remarkable was that the amplification didn't come from burning potential or consuming life force. It worked by reinforcing the meridians directly. He sat down and began cultivating, thinking that the meridians were the conductors of all spiritual power, and strengthening them was no simple task. The fact that the Sacred Origin Art could do it at all spoke volumes about just how extraordinary its creator had been. Now it was time to find out exactly how many times he could amplify his spiritual power with it. 3 days later, he was still locked in seclusion, pushing the technique further with every passing hour. He formed a miniature version of the blazing flame palm in his palm, and released it. The resulting explosion tore through the room and dissolved a magic circle that had been embedded in the wall. A portal opened beside him. The Saintess stepped through and observed that even with a defensive formation running at full capacity, he'd produced destruction of that magnitude. His speed of comprehension with the Sacred Origin Art had exceeded all expectations. Zhao Mu greeted her. She reached out and tapped his face lightly with her foot, and told him now that he'd passed the tests of all three elders, it was time he changed how he addressed her. He felt a little heat rise to his face and called her master. Yeah, he went from human battery to her personal disciple. If you're not subscribed yet, what are you even doing? Hit that button right now. The Saintess told him she'd already spoken with Elder Dugu Qiang. They could leave immediately. She bound him with a tendril of spiritual energy and pulled him into a subspace. A few seconds later, he was thrown onto a bed, and she settled on top of him, looking down at him and asking did he know why she had accepted him as her disciple, and we are not getting that answer today. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because that conversation is going to break the internet. And that's where we're leaving it for today, guys. I know, don't throw your phone. The answer is coming in part 2, but only if you're subscribed. That question she just asked him, it's not innocent, not even a little bit. If you enjoyed the video, smash that like button, drop a comment telling me what you think her real reason is, and subscribe so you're first in line when part 2 drops. The algorithm is cold and ruthless, just like these cultivators. Don't let it bury this from you. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.